Okay, hello. If you can hear us or see us, please let me know. Hello. Good to see you all. Hi. Oh my god, I'm so excited for today.
It's going to be a good one, particularly because we've been off for a week as we had to deal with all of the internet, apparently fishmen. According to all of you out there, it was fishmen
Black
that have
Goblin,
stopped
Skaven,
us. Yeah, totally. It has been somewhat of a technical nightmare for us, either on my side or on Sotek's side for one reason or another. But we're here, we're back, and hopefully you can hear us.
I Okay, great. We're live on YouTube now. Okay, good. Good. We're all set. All right.
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah. This will be a really good time. We do apologize for the delays, but it was out of our hands. It was powers beyond our ability to contend with. But thankfully, it's all fixed now. It's all good now. I'm very, very excited for this one because in all of that extra time, I got to do a lot of extra reading, and I ended up getting into such a I don't know what word would be best used for it, but I got so obscenely focused I ended up like not sleeping for an entire night, and I made myself really ill for
hyper focus.
So. Yeah, so but I got a lot of really, really cool notes. There's a lot of old ones we're going to talk about today and stuff. But now that we're all good and everything's all up and running, just a few little very, very quick things of that. We'll do something as usual this Wednesday. I don't know what.
Yes, we'll
do something. Also, next Sunday on the Loremaster of Sotek channel.
Streams.
Yes, we're going to start the anniversary series. So next Sunday is going to be a live Q&A stream where y'all will be able to ask literally about anything related to Warhammer Fantasy and maybe even some things beyond that. But so that'll be a great stream. If you're like, I want to ask about this thing and I know they're never going to cover it, well, then that's the stream to show up to.
Straight. We'll get a poster up for all of our birthday celebrations because we've been doing this together now for over a year now. So we'll get a poster for that up next week because we're doing a full month's worth of special streams to say thanks to all of you for watching us chat about lore that we kind of love and we can't stop sharing.
Yep. And if y'all could also make sure to let us know if we sound roughly equivalent, that'd be great. For those that have been enjoying the podcast, I have been those have been uploading daily for at least the last week. So a lot of stuff has gotten caught up. So hopefully you're all enjoying that. And I think from there, we'll just for anyone that may be new to this, when super chats or Twitch bits or things like that come in, which we always really appreciate, we take them in bunches or batches between various like subject matters. That way we're not interrupting ourselves. So we'll start with those here in just a second, but I think that's everything until maybe just some minor stuff at the end. So without further ado, we're just going to knock out the super chats that came in kind of like right before the stream started, and then we will get into it. All right, Magladrov. Yay, the fishermen were defeated. Indeed, they were. On another note, any hints to my Catan brethren in fantasy, or is the role of ancient antagonists who predate the Old One gods goes to the Fisherman Elder God? So yeah, there's not a lot about like pre-Old One times. And the Catan just don't exist in fantasy. There are no ancient evil star gods that eat stars and had a big fight with the Old Ones. They are not around in fantasy. They got kicked out and allowed the focus to be on the Old Ones versus Chaos, which I don't know. I think it's a more fun fight anyway. But yeah. So whoop-de-doo.
That.
Fire Snake, it was not in the great plan for the discussion to be last week. Apparently not.
Yeah. Tell us about it.
Also, I just want to say the system that we use for streaming, which is called StreamYards, it's so much nicer now. They introduced a dark mode finally. Oh, it's so nice. I'm not being blinded by my screen anymore. Let's be honest, we're all old ones at this point. Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, gosh, I'm feeling it. That much is certain. Look at the gray in my beard.
For the Lorebeards, for the old ones, for the fishmen who are secretly the children of the old ones. Now that's just heretical. On this side, question for the previous stream, Vampire Coast stuff. Shanties were historically working songs to coordinate movement between sailors. Zombies obviously don't need that. So why would the Vampire Coast have shanties, channeling magic, vanity, lingering spirits of sailors? So if you want the real answer, because it's fun.
It's fucking fun. That's
the only answer. Realistically, would they need one? Probably
I was writing up a bit for this at one point, all the way back when the Dreadfleet rules were kicking around, and I incorporated shanties and chants into the magic systems that my version were using at that point, because it made it funner, if anything.
Actually,
and chanting is a core component of at least 2 of the winds of magic, so there was no reason that wouldn't work. So that's what I did with my version. If I was doing it again, I would probably incorporate that too, because it's just fun.
Yeah, I'll say that's actually just flat out canon now, as the way Total War interpreted the storyline for the Vampire Coast, if you've never played it, is that you are collecting the 3 main segments of a shanty that has a very powerful magical thing to it. It's literally like this chanting verse that the zombies chant through, that if they complete the full verse, as they sing their way through it, it makes your zombies more and more powerful. And it builds up to, if you get the full version, it plays into enchanting the harpoon that you use to kill Aminar. So yeah, magic. Jen, I just wanted to let Andy know that all of my Greenskin campaigns will have a lord named Dork in his arm. Because Andy, Dork's great.
Brilliant.
Sean Schultz, did Andy ever meet or talk with the old ones?
I kind of feel like an old one, if I'm honest. But strictly speaking, no.
I mean, I'm gonna say he's not gonna like it, but I'm gonna say it. Of that, like, I think if you physically worked on the Tome of Salvation, it's a card you just get. I'm like, congrats, you're an old one now. Here you go.
Yeah, thanks for that. Cheers.
Jacob Wood, I've been watching since the reboot of Lorebeards and finally got some cash to ask a question. I've been wondering this entire time, who the fuck is Crimlo? So
I will touch on that in a moment, because it's going to be a part of my intro.
Oh, great.
Much as that may upset Sotek, it will be mentioned in the intro.
It's fine by me. The TLDR I'm going to give you before Andy gets into it is basically just that he's just a pseudo goofy character. He's from... I'll just let Andy do it.
I'll get to it. Don't worry. I will get to that one, because Kremlo is it's a fun character, if you wish it to be so. But will definitely be popping up in my intro.
Yep. But speaking of which, it's time.
Oh, well, we just jump in, not deal with the other super chats before we go?
Oh, I didn't realize more people jumped in.
Yeah,
my thing hadn't updated yet. Never mind. Over a year already. Thank you, Alfred. Love listening to you two talk about the lore and see your friendship grow. The Warhammer 3 stream was a lot of fun. Jesus, I looked at that and I was like, wow. We stream?
Yeah, I did the same. I was like, did we do a Nintendo one? Am I that old? Have I forgotten it?
Sir Panza, thank you for continuing to post those up podcast. They really help me get through your job. No problem. There will be another wave of those coming very, very soon. Singe Master, Andy, can you... I'll let you deal with that.
Kaylee. Can you find a Kaylee anywhere in Tempire? So you'll find that there's all manner of different local folk dances across the Empire, but I won't go into many details there. But in particular, Ostermark, who absolutely adore them. But the equivalent to Kaylee's in my version of the Empire are up in Nordland.
There you go. I don't know what that is, but all right.
It's a Scottish get-together big dance. Good time.
I see. All right. So
there's still another couple to go.
They just keep coming. Thank you. We appreciate it. Mornington Crescent, how far back does the canon go? I assume not the Starboat.
Oh, well, we're going to be getting into that.
So I will say that for the purposes of what the old ones are now, all of the routes that I followed pretty much dry up once you hit 5th edition. Anything before that is very, very different and not really helpful.
I'm going to contradict that deeply.
Yeah, well,
just watch.
We'll see what Andy does there. But that being said, there are a couple of notes about how the old ones we have now kind of got their character over the course of the editions that I actually find really, really interesting. There's a couple of actually genuinely funny notes about it, but we'll get into that when we get into that. Baron von Baster, will we ever get a Lorebeards of the Uberschreck 5 in the Vermintide game? That is very, very likely.
Yeah, it's pretty likely, isn't it?
I would say that is super likely.
I love Fat Shark, so any opportunity to chat about their stuff is always a welcome aside for me.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Brian Lyons, playing Total War 3 while listening to this and a cup of coffee. No better way to spend a Sunday morning trying out the new Colts mechanic with Kugoth. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, the new Colt mechanic is really nice. There's a couple of small tweaks I need to recommend in a video, but overall it is vastly improved. Like, oh my lord, it is so much better. Darcy, I'm curious, if you had to add a new old one with its own theme / domain, what would you add? So this one's actually not as hard as it seems, because generally speaking, when you're dealing with the old ones, the general rule of thumb is that the Lizardmen, and nobody, but the Lizardmen are the closest to having a chance, but even the Lizardmen don't really remember what the old ones actually are. And so they're given certain themes and concepts that tie back to them in a sense. And some of them are extremely esoteric and extremely like ethereal type things. And some of them are much more grounded, you know, where it's like, oh, well, this guy was a war god. That's pretty straightforward. And then you'll have another one that's like, oh, this is a god of a very bizarre metaphysical concept. So whenever you want to go, well, can I make my own old one? The answer is absolutely yes, because there were hundreds of them, and I have what I genuinely believe is the exhaustive list, and there's only 25 of them, which is a lot, but it's not a lot when you consider how big their race actually was. So really all you have to do is just kind of pick something you think would be interesting, something that represents a concept that would be observed in the world. And where it gets particularly fun, if you're making your own, is if you delve into concepts that would not relate well to the Lizardmen, but do relate well to the other warm-blooded species. That's where you get a lot of the really interesting old ones, because the Lizardmen don't get it, to put it very bluntly. There is one particular very, very big, important old one we're going to talk about today that the Lizardmen just ignore because they don't understand it. And so that is probably what I would lean the heaviest into, because you could have a lot of fun of exploring why certain races have some of the things that they do, and you can say that it ties back to a particular old one who had a particular domain, and you can have a lot of fun exploring things like that. But as far as like, is there a specific thing I would add? Nothing off the super top of my head, just because my brain is far more focused on what I actually have to talk about today. But I'm talking, you'll notice there's a lot of cats.
If you're going to do this one, do it at the end of the cast for this particular question, because then you've gone through everything. So it'd probably be best then.
Pixel Brick just started reading the Dwarfs Omnibus. Andy, I see your name at the front page.
Yeah.
What did you work on in that book?
A mixture of lore checks, maps, pictures and stuff. I did a variety of small jobs in that book. It was good times. But yeah, there's quite a few of the war maps are mine in there, and a couple of the illustrations too. Assuming that all of the ones that I did are in that, because I'm not sure.
Yeah, because that it includes Grudge Lore. Grudge Lore is the last part of that book. So
totally.
Can we expect an Enemy Within stream in the future? Yes.
Yeah.
Kinda.
One of the issues with a stream like The Enemy Within is it's a gigantic spoiler, because it's a story that lots of people say, oh, I'm never going to do it, and then 1 year later they find themselves in a game of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay playing it, and we tend to try and avoid something that's a direct spoiler of stuff. Having said that, though, it's such a core and fundamental aspect of where the Warhammer world as we know it came from that I definitely think doing a stream about it would be very much worthwhile, with a strong set of caveats at the beginning, laying out that if you watch this, you are going to be getting an awful lot of information that will ruin your day if you ever play it.
There's some things I would like to talk about revolving around what it is, in addition to its impact, in addition to like because there are some ways I'd like to have some LAWhammer Lorebeard tie-ins just for funsies, because they're such adjacent shows in a sense. So the answer is kind of yes, but it would be different than how we've done other things.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Kremlo remembers what the old ones actually are, though. Well, we're going to talk about Kremlo.
Totally doesn't.
I'm caught up now, so I'm going to let Andy just
is my volume a little bit low? Because it shouldn't be. It says it's not on this side, but if it is, do tell me. I can be heard on my side. I'll come in a bit closer to my mic, just in case. I think we're ready to start. Are you ready to start on your side? Okay, let us go. The old ones. Us old grey people remember the old ones. So, for the old ones, I like to start with a bit of a retrospective whenever we do one of these intros. I like to start at the beginning, but when it comes to the old ones, the beginning predates Warhammer itself. And that in itself is super fun. Now, I could say that for many Warhammer topics, but for this one in particular, it's worth noting that the fingerprints of the old ones extend far further back into the past than simply Warhammer itself. Because it's the core concept, the trope of this ancient civilization that has fallen and has got these children of the gods continuing on in its stead afterwards. And this was a classic trope of fantasy, science fiction, and indeed alternative history throughout the course of the 20th century, in particular with pulp fiction that was released through the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, where you'd have various characters of heroic proportions making their way deep into, say, deepest, darkest Africa, as they would refer to it, or alternatively into the steaming jungles of South America to discover some ancient peoples and lost cities of gold. Warhammer, when it came in the 80s, was riffing on everything that existed in pulp fiction and science fiction and fantasy and history. So when we get the very first edition of Warhammer all the way back in 1983, we have ourselves the first glimpse of what will become the old ones later. In particular, there's one species that's going to come up again and again and again throughout the course of this stream, and that's the Slann. Originally, the Slann are not the Slann that we know today, but they kind of are too, and I'll get into that as we progress onwards. Originally, the Slann look, let's keep it nice and simple. Imagine a human who's a frog. That's your Slann. There's various cartoons in the 80s with mutant frog type people. They looked like those too. They are human-sized, froggy, and can jump really far because they got frog-like legs. And they take on most of the tropes of the Central and South American indigenous peoples and have them dropped on top with a big, huge feather fall of gold and jade. And that is your original Slann. They were an entire species, not a single one, that those of you who perhaps play Warhammer today or play the Total War game would recognize as the giant toad on a throne. No, 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 no. They didn't look like that to begin with. They looked like frog people. And they were completely discrete from everyone else. They didn't have Lizardmen minions. The Lizardmen were a completely different species that worked underground at this point. They were a subterranean species, much like the dwarves are a subterranean species. And the troglodytes and the Lizardmen folk and similar were over in Lustria and similar, but were not the dinosaur men that we know today as the Lizardmen. So we have ourselves these frog people. And over the course of the years from about 1983 up to 1987, these frog people were given every single trope that you could ever imagine that escaped from those pulpy years earlier concerning ancient civilizations that had devolved. And come 1987, with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition, we get it all cleanly wrapped up. By this point, we had had a host of Slann already in the setting. Most of them were things like Jaguar warriors and blowpipe-wielding individuals, or the infamous Kremlo. And I told you we were going to mention Kremlo. Kremlo was a Slann who had been washed up as a child into Skeggi, a settlement that many of you might know out there already, a Norse settlement, and had been raised as a Norse person and was used all the way back in the first edition of Warhammer as a special character that was inside the Norse versus Lizardmen, well, Slann section, a bunch of battles in the very first compendium for Warhammer First Edition. Back then, toughness was a letter. It wasn't even a number. That was a weird time. But let's not discuss those earlier versions of Warhammer, nor do we need to necessarily discuss Kremlo. He's just a Slann that sits on the side. One of many, and the Slann species are codified in the third edition and into the fourth, and in the in the third edition of Warhammer, first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And these are our Lizardmen, who are very much like the Mesoamerican people in general. And they're frogs, all of them, every last one. And inside the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, we get our first clear story of the Old Slann. And the Old Slann are, what we will later call the Old Ones, the great spacefaring species that had arrived on the Warhammer world in silver ships. And when they were there, they had taken the known world, and it was typically referred to then, the known world, and they had moved it gently closer to the sun to warm it, causing all of the great icy sheets to recede. And then they had colonized it. They founded their first city over in the west in Lustria. And from there, they watched the world like the sorcerer scientists that they were. And they saw the elves and liked them. The elves were, at this point, the children of the Old Slann. And they were picked up from the old world and they were dropped into Ulthuan. And they were, let's say, experimented upon. Alternatively, you could say monitored. Alternatively, you could say magic-y scienced. The dwarves, as the ice peaks retreated, came out and began to show their faces into the light for the first time from what would be the equivalent of modern-day Africa, and started pushing up the spine of the world. They were similarly picked up by the Old Slann, and the Old Slann turned them into what they are known today as in the dwarves. But they didn't do the great genetic manipulations that we will get much later. They were generally described as arriving and going, "Hi, we're the Old Slann. This is how you farm. This is how you mine. This is how you do stuff." And all of the species of the Warhammer world that were there were uplifted, generally through technology. And this technology was often not more expansive than, this is how agriculture works. This is how you do tiered farming. Because the Old Slann picked up the old trope of the gods of the real world. Now, for those of you out there who've ever read any conspiracy theory nonsense regarding alternative histories, the fingerprints of the gods, if we go back to the 70s and the 80s, the whole idea of there was used to be in the real world an ancient civilization that we remember today as gods that uplifted all of the various peoples across the world. This is what the Old Slann were. They were replicating this story. Games Workshop, as it was by this point, rather than Citadel Miniatures, which started the first Warhammer, were taking all of the stories from the real world and translating them into a new version for the Warhammer world. And the Old Slann were these original gods. And they were the ones that changed the Warhammer world completely and gave all of the various species across the world what they required to become more advanced. Then the cataclysm came. And with the cataclysm was the coming of chaos. The Old Slann had arrived on silvered ships and had created enormous warp gates, in particular two, one at each pole, although you will note that in the original story only one of them probably collapses, not necessarily both. The other collapses in a different way, and this will be riffed upon when we eventually reach the 5th edition version of the story, where there's only a single chaos gate mentioned in the 5th edition version of the story. But we'll get to that in a moment. The gate collapses, or both gates collapse, in what can only be described as an event that is shrouded in mystery at this point, and chaos comes. And the Old Slann are gone in one fashion or another. And what we have left is the Slann, who are the frog people. And the Slann are the shattered remnants of this early civilization. The shattered remains that no longer remember the great technological peaks they once had. They no longer remember the great gates. What they are is they are worshipping the Old Slann as gods. They are worshipping what came before, and not just praising them as divine entities, but also replicating what they did. So going through the motions of what the Old Slann used to do because of ritual reasons and a complete lack of understanding of why they actually were or should be doing it. These Slann are surprisingly similar to what will be recreated in 1997 when we hit the Lizardmen army list, our first one, because they work with spawning pools. They've got the same old tech that sort of collapsed down, the engines of the gods. All of these things are incorporated and built into the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and that becomes the 4th edition of Warhammer Warhammer later, and not that much later. Warhammer 4th edition, and this is the edition that we all know and love as effectively creating the Warhammer world as we understand it. This is the one where Teclis and Tyrion comes in, Nagash arrives. All of the characters that we know today and are still used in Total War pretty much get created by the 4th edition of the game. And if you leaf back to the very first High Elf Army List, that was the second book out for Warhammer 4th edition as an army list. And the creation of the world, we have the Old Slann, not the Old Ones. The term the Old Ones had yet to be used in Warhammer, but the Old Slann was incorporated throughout every single publication, White Dwarf article, and similar. In 40k, though, things were a bit different. 40k, it arrived around about the same time as the Fantasy Roleplay game, and it took everything that was in Warhammer and said, what if we put it in space? Yeah! And the first edition of 40k, so that's Rogue Trader, is quite different to what comes later. The first edition of 40k is basically Warhammer in space, but if we incorporated tons of extra bits from 2000 AD and Dune, let's use those two as sources, but there's more on top of that. But what if we did all that and popped it all in, and it is a much more hopeful setting than what would come over in the second edition of Warhammer 40,000 when Andy Chambers takes over, and his slightly bleaker tone and the hopelessness of 40k gets largely put into place. But that's by the by. But is it? Because in the initial version of Warhammer, we have a 40k, we have the Slann, and we have the Old Slann, and we have the Old Ones. And the Old Ones are laced through our initial version of 40k, and they continue. I'm going to drop a small aside from the 4th edition of 40k here as well, because it's directly relevant to what we're going to be discussing here today. The Old Slann are still a thing, but they're now, broadly speaking, on the 40k side, more the Old Ones. They're the things that came beforehand. They are the ancient spacefaring empire that used to exist everywhere before all of 40k came into place. And they have collapsed. And they're no longer there, but the Slann still are, as this ancient, weird, frog-like species that are still out there. Blood Bowl picks this up as well. You get a Blood Bowl team of Slann who are all frogmen who can bounce around with their good old long limbs, and they're a pretty damn good team. I had a Lizardmen army. I had a Blood
I still
Bowl
find
Lizard...
it so amazing that the video game Blood Bowl wanted that team. So they were like, can we have the Slann? Games Workshop said, well, no. And they're like, well, what if we made them a new team? Games Workshop goes, fine. So what did they turn the Slann team into? The Kislev Circus. Such a funny team.
So we end up with Slann and Old Slann all over the place, but the concept of the Old Ones was beginning to creep in. And throughout the 4th edition of Warhammer, the Old Slann is still the term for the Old Ones, because they are the originators of the Slann, the frog people, and they are the genetic, shall we say, precursors, in that the Slann that came afterwards were the Old Ones, but they had forgotten what they once were because of the cataclysm. Because of all the events that had occurred, they no longer were this old Slann. They were a completely different species in many respects. Then we hit the big one, the Lizardmen Army List, 1997. And I remember when this came out, and it was extraordinary, because for the first time we moved from the Slann being this great species of frogmen down in Lustria and possibly elsewhere, to actually, no, we're going to pull on all the old tropes. We're going to take our ancient folk, and we're going to also say they come from the land of dinosaurs, because, hey, that's cool. We get a very Victorian view. It's amazing just how much this is influenced by Victoriana and a Victorian image of what the land of the lost dinosaurs might look like. And they turn the Slann into the land of the lost dinosaurs, but no, not quite, because the Slann are still there. And it's the Slann that we know and love today. The great toad maid priest that sits upon his big throne, either being carted around, if you go with some earlier models with their good old temple guard, or alternatively, literally floating there as they progress that onwards, looking like some sort of giant fat toad throne-bearing thing, which is well cool. And I remember when this came out, and all of us talking about it, going, hey, the old Slann are now just called the Old Ones. Neat. that brings it into 40k, and it makes it all work together as one setting. Because at that point, it was one setting. Don't listen to the people who say it wasn't. It was. They were all working together. But by this point, Games Workshop was already going, let's separate them a bit, because we probably should, because we want them to be their own things, but, you know. But the old Slann are now called the Old Ones. Cool. And nobody thought that the Old Ones were anything other than the old Slann. At this point, there was no differentiation. It wasn't they've become something new. It was nothing more than, hey, the Slann are now just the Toad Mage Priests who lead everything. Interesting. Why did they become fat? And one of the biggest conversations at that time was, why have the Slann, who are still an existing point of 40k and Warhammer lore, become these fat toads instead? What had changed from what they were to what they had become? And the great question that was often discussed at that point wasn't, what are the Old Ones? We all knew what the Old Ones were. They were the Slann. The big question was, why had the Slann changed? What had occurred during the cataclysm that had made them fat? And the general answer, that was largely a fan theory more than anything else, although behind the scenes it was a bit more than that, was magic. They had been filled through with the perverting magics of chaos and had swollen fat on them in some fashion or another. This does not become a thing, but that most certainly was a discussion at the time. So we now have Slann, who are great administrators of the Old Ones, but they aren't really. If you read the story, what they are is completely feckless, utterly useless, unknowing entities who have no idea what the Old Ones were doing at all. They're merely the later spawnings of the Old Ones' great plan, and they're attempting to understand and in many respects worship and ritualistically repeat. Oh, wait a minute, they're exactly the same as the old Slann. They've just added some Lizardmen on. Right, gotcha. And at the time, there was no expectation that they were in any way different. Everybody thought, oh, they've just added a bunch of dinosaurs underneath the Slann. Interesting. We no longer have ourselves Jaguar warriors moving through who are basically Toad warriors. Now the Slann are sitting up in their temples doing their stuff. Love it. And as each edition of Warhammer moved on from this place, they created more distance with each one, but never removed it. And I think this is something that is worth noting, that until we get the latest versions of what many of the old ones might be, there is still that space where the Slann are nothing more than the first spawnings of the old ones in the Warhammer world. And that is something that's worth always keeping at the back of your mind while simultaneously going, no, there's something different. But there's not just hints of this inside the existing lore and in 40k. They pretty much state it in more than one place. For example, go over to Warhammer 40k 4th edition. The Slann are depicted in the 4th edition, named the Slann-E, and they are not the big fat toads, which had been running around in 40k for some time. They're depicted by John Blanche as the original Slann. They are still the Slann that came before, the frog warriors that we knew and loved. A huge debate at the time as to what that meant, and it brought up again the question, why did the Warhammer Slann become fat? What had changed? What had made that become a thing? And as time went on, and the earlier versions were kind of forgotten by the writers, and they started creating their own versions, the Slann are parted further and further from the old ones until we have, loosely speaking, what we have today. Where today we have ourselves a bunch of old ones that arrived in the Warhammer world and wrought extraordinary change upon it, and there was a cataclysm. This cataclysm destroyed one of the core planet-sized warp gates that they used to get into the old world, and in turn wiped out the old ones in the most mysterious and uncertain fashion. They were no longer there. That left the Lizardmen, and in particular the Slann, bereft of those who had created them. The children of the gods no longer had their gods. And as time went by, the children of the gods began to worship the old ones as if they were gods, continuing their great plan ritualistically without understanding what that plan was in any way, shape, or form. In many respects, you could almost see it as a Warhammer version of Lord of the Flies, in that we have a bunch of kids who've been just dropped into a place and they start making their own traditions based upon the stuff that they find and then collapse into this weird state. And in some respects, that's what the Lizardmen have become. They are peoples who used to have mum and dad just sitting there going, hi, do this and do that. But when they were still in their infancy, were abandoned and no longer understand what or who they are, but do have all of the plans, as they refer to them, encoded upon all of their temples and their great golden plaques. And they attempt to see that through. They attempt to understand mum and dad who came before, the great old ones. So to conclude my big introduction before we start diving into all the old ones, who they are, how they've changed, and all the rest of it as we move on, there is a core question. Are the Slann still the descendants of the old ones? The answer is no, or yes, because it's never overwritten. And there was a discussion, which I think is a nice way to end this particular intro. There was a discussion behind the scenes when we were trying to pin down what should or shouldn't go into the roleplay book for 4th edition about this. And at this point of the roleplay book, it wasn't just a book about Reichland, which is what the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition book became. There was a bit of a discussion about exactly what could and couldn't be included for a Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay book like the 1st edition of the game, which included the history of the world. And that question came up. And the answer was, they're probably the same. And that was, for me, kind of validating. But at the same point,
I'm about to shit over all this so hard.
Exactly. The probably didn't make sense. Because by this point, there had already been written a host of extra material, which made it look like that was possibly unlikely. And another conversation came up, which was, then how do we justify all this other material, all this other goodies about the old ones and what they could be? And the answer was, no one understood them at all. The old Slann became the new Slann later, but they didn't, because they all died during that Great War. The new Slann were the first spawnings, and that's it. They definitely weren't what came before. And the stories of the ones that came with them from other ships, the ones that came with them from other worlds, were nothing more than the very first kids of the ones from the true empire that came before. And they just don't know who they are because they're basically babies. And those who look back and try to understand the other ones are basically trying to understand figures they can't, because it's not them anymore. It was altogether too complicated. And I was like, why don't we just keep it muddy like it is everywhere else? And that was the direction that we were going to keep. Because that was going to be the old ones space Slann slot that we did for the beginning of the world. But then afterwards, it's worth noting we get one extra major detail beyond all of the specifics concerning the old ones. And that's what the old world offers. And the old world does something that none of the previous editions did. And the old one says, the old world pretty much directly states that what happens in the Warhammer world wasn't a mistake. That the plan was for Age of Sigmar from the outset. And that completely changes everything in terms of the tone of the old ones. Because up until the release of the old world, the story was basically a bunch of spacefarers arrived. They put a big network across the world. They started in Lustria and spread out. From there, they colonized, they changed everything. But one of their great gates that they were using up in the north blew up, and they died in the fallout from that. Some of them continued to fight, some of them didn't, and eventually they vanished for whatever reason, and it was a great catastrophe. But the old world says, you know that great catastrophe? It was the plan all along. And that is controversial and almost certainly to be overwritten by other books. And you'll probably find that, as often is the case with Warhammer, it will be muddied. And possibly some old ones will have wanted it to happen this way. Some of them won't. There'll be different plans, because in the end, they were a species of some sort with individual motivations, individual concerns, and individual wants and desires. And I think through the course of this one, as we do dive into many of the individual old ones themselves, we'll see that they are a much more complicated species nowadays than they were originally. They're no longer simply old slan. But if you wish to try and make that link, it can still be done for those of you who are deeply old and you like to do that sort of thing.
Okay. I'm gonna get to these super chats because like I am pulling at the leash. I'm ready to go. All right, that dude from Chrono Trigger was a slan? Yes. Here is Rose. Hi, with many of the giant primordial megafauna, such as the Shaggots, toad dragons, many giant sea monsters, there's a possibility many of them were the inspiration for many different gods of the younger races. Yes. But I wouldn't don't go so far as to be like, oh, all the gods we have now are big, super colossal monster things. But there are groups that worship those creatures. Like a really easy example is that Kolek Sun Eater is worshipped as a thunder god by a lot of different tribes. So yeah, a lot of the megafauna are absolutely worshipped as gods. Because why wouldn't you? I mean, they are primordial ancient beings, and some of them are super intelligent and basically are gods in a lot of ways. Watchdog, what do you think the pre-old ones race that would become the elves, dwarfs, and so on, or would they spawn out wholesale? So this is one of the things that depending on which author you ask, you're gonna get different answers. The more recent writings lean a little heavier into there were precursor races that the old ones kind of found were like, oh, if we develop these and advance them a little more, and they took about 10 to 12,000 years to advance most of them, which is a long time, but not a long time by most evolutionary standards. Because like the elves and dwarves don't really pop up until like a couple thousand years before the cataclysm happens. And that still gives the old ones and the lizardmen like 12,000 years of farting around and doing other stuff. But I would say that most sources do not say they were spawned out. Most say that they were elevated. Now, what exactly that means is more up to your own interpretation.
I'd agree entirely on that one. I would say that the strongest story that we have is that the old ones arrive, that there was existing species on what was referred to originally as the Gnome World, and then often later the Warhammer World, and then the world that was, and then they rename it every other year nowadays because they want to just use Warhammer as a strapline, which means that it's no longer just Warhammer as it was originally, which was the fantasy game. But most of the stories now are quite clear that each of those species were uplifted. Now, uplifted could be just given information, contacted by, or alternatively could be genetically manipulated through a mixture of sorcery science. The general conclusion is probably a bit of all of them. Yeah,
probably a good mix. Ryan Woodall, my stream randomly kicked back to the Black Kag stream. I was like, are the old ones messing with me? And Sotek, what is happening? Well, we really appreciate that. And, hey, we always appreciate when y'all watch the old streams too. Thank you very much. Roderick, just jumping in the show. Appreciate for the stream about people like me. I turned 40 today.
Hey, young man. Us old ones over here are looking at your 40-year-old with a certain amount of, I remember 40. Oh, man.
Someone of Aztec ancestry. I love everything about the lizardmen except the names. They're completely unpronounceable in Nahuatl. I imagine a monocled Brit saying, close enough. That is exactly
spot on. And it's not just some of the original names are, if anything, worse. Actually, no, that's a lie. Some of the very original names were actually pretty decent. As we moved into the 5th edition of Warhammer, Nigel Stillman's original names for all manner of characters he added were just all jokes.
5th edition book is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like, y'all think the names now are bad? 5th edition, you read and you go, what the fuck is this? Every single name is a pun. Except for, like, I think Oxiodal. I think he's the only character that isn't. But it's bad. Later books kind of tried to fix it, and the bad thing is that a lot of those names are kind of cemented in people's minds. Which is unfortunate, because like it'd be nice to have someone go back through who actually understands the language and rename everything. Because the Lizardmen's definitely suffered from British creationism.
Agreed completely. Some of the names are unforgivably bad.
Magladroth, was Age of Sigmar the main plan or the worst case scenario, or is their plan completely in shambles? If everything is pre-planned, doesn't that make them OP? So, okay, I'm going to talk a lot about this in just a little bit, because my research, I went all the way back to 5th edition, and I worked my way all the way to the modern edition of Age of Sigmar. So there's a lot we're going to talk about, especially revolving around the Great Plan. So we will come back to that. Ricky Trapman, glad to see Zuvison has not messed with the stream this time. How many beings... how many beings that saw the old ones are still around? We know Dragon Ogres and the Dragon Emperor were around, but anyone else? So the ancient dragons saw and knew them to the point where the ancient dragons had a name for them, being the Shantar, which is what the dragons called them.
Yep.
But those were like the big ancient dragons. So the Celestial Dragon Emperor is one of them. His kids were aware of them, though it's hard to say whether or not they saw them, but they were definitely aware of them. Games Workshop usually likes to play the card that anyone who saw the old ones is no longer around or no longer active. So if you ask them, they would probably be like, oh yeah, the Moon Empress and the Emperor saw them, but they're also not active anymore. So, you're not going to learn anything about them. Whereas the 9 children likely did not see them. There's not a... Games Workshop tries and kind of fails, but tries to suggest that there is nobody alive today who has seen an old one. Because if anyone alive has seen an old one, they would be able to provide information that would immediately screw up some of the mystery, which is the way some writers feel about it. I don't agree because of some of the notes they leave down. I think you could have characters that have seen old ones and it could still work for reasons I'll talk about in a little bit in regards to what information we have about them. But it seems like if you're writing about the old ones, GW's general rule of thumb to a writer is to say no one's allowed to have seen them.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's interesting to see how that changed over the editions, because obviously at Warhammer 1st to 4th edition, it wasn't a problem at all. They were just old slan. So no issues in the slightest. They were the transcendental beings that existed beforehand, and then they fell, the coming of chaos, and turned into what became the slan. That was the clear story that was being projected by all of the lore. 5th edition comes, and that gets completely eroded in the 5th, but not properly until the later writings is completely broken down. So that is when all of the mystery is added, and the great mystery of the old ones is put in place, particularly because it's also attempting to both marry through to the 40k version of the lore while simultaneously trying to ignore it. It's a lovely, interesting place that the writers sort of get themselves into.
Yeah, man, when I have some free time, I have a document sitting somewhere on my PC of the unreleased, but pretty much finished, 1st edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Lustria supplement, just for anyone that wants to look at it, because it's wild to read nowadays. If you look at it, you're like, this is fucking weird, because it has a lot of stuff about the old Slan. Like, the playable races were literally, you could be a Slan, an Amazon, or a Pygmy. And it's a wild book. Henry Ham, if most old ones supported the plan and ended with the end times, then it's a funny idea that the missing Sri Lanka, the lost it has, is finding another way to get to AOS without the end times. We will talk a fair bit about Sri Lanka, because he's a very, very interesting old one. Baron Von Baster, could Nakai have been an old one since he's a first generation croc score, and that is why he's so directionally confused? So Nakai is really funny, because there's 2 things about him. A, he is a first generation croc score, so he was around when they were around. However, the lore, once you hit 6th edition, is very explicit at stating that no, only the first generation Slan ever saw the old ones. They were the only ones that could handle talking to them. It doesn't really say why, but it's like only they had like the magical comprehensive ability to deal with an old one, not have their brain explode out of the back of their head or something. And though a really funny thing about Nakai that makes me laugh is that there is a mention about Nakai in the 4th edition Lustria supplement for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, where they're trying to discuss how Kroxigors are fairly simple creatures, very straightforward, and are more about following instructions that they're given and so they try and explain how the hell Nakai makes any sense. And the answer they come up with makes me giggle every time, because it basically says that the Kroxigors have an extra organ somewhere in their brain that sometimes just kind of gives them like a random direction, and it's believed by the Lizardmen that it's like the old ones giving them instructions. So Nakai basically has some kind of weird receiver in his brain that just tells him where to go. That's like the old ones like, hey, go over to this place. Go to this place. It just makes me laugh every time. He's just got a walkie-talkie in his head. Didn't Drakenfels see them arrive? Yes, yep. Drakenfels did see the old ones, yeah. But you'll notice Drakenfels is also not around anymore.
Although, no, Drakenfels absolutely is around. He's in the most recent version of the roleplay games and is also in constant re-release from Black Library. So
true, but he's not in the sense that like he's not used, but in the sense that he's not. You wouldn't be able to have a discussion with him about it. It's probably the best way I would put it.
Even that, he was reused in the end times as well. So yeah,
but he didn't have any memories in the end times. He's just the nameless
because they didn't know exactly where the IP lay.
Henry, no one objects, Your Honor. My first witness is Crook, who's dead. To be fair,
yeah.
But I will talk about why. So actually, I'll just do it now. I will say that I am definitely on the team that the idea that no one has seen an old one that is around is dumb. Phil, I'll get to your thing right here in a second. Because frankly, the amount of characters running around the world who are incredibly ancient but are still active is extremely high. Plus, you have Lord Croak, who as every edition has been added, his sentience gets added to more and more and more. To the point where he's just kind of bluntly able to talk to other Slaanesh, or at least show them visions. And the idea that Lord Croak wouldn't be like, hey, here's an old one, is very weird and is very odd. And they never explain it because they just don't want to. And as we'll talk about, a lot of the information that other authors have sort of unintentionally, I think at times, when you collate it all together about the old ones, gets them in a bit of a whoopsie, where some of the information I'm going to share with y'all, you're going to go, I kind of feel like I can imagine what an old one is, and I'm going to go, yeah, you probably can.
Yeah, I agree completely. The idea that the old ones are unknowable to anyone on the Warhammer world is, I think, an absolute fiction that has been created by the desire to keep them mysterious, not by the established lore that already exists around the entirety of what we know to live within the Warhammer world. There are going to be multiple entities that have encountered them. There's going to be multiple entities that have memories of them, and there's going to be multiple entities that have possibly even directly treated with them in some fashion or another, because for all we say the cataclysm was in the mists of time and unknowable, it is to everybody in the Warhammer world except for those who were there. And there are still a whole host of entities walking around the Warhammer world that were there at the cataclysm. And we're not just talking about after the cataclysm, like most of the elf characters we know are all mostly post-cataclysm characters. Even the most ancient ones are ones who were born during the cataclysm, so the old ones are gone, probably. But we've got a bunch that were there at the cataclysm, too many of them now, that we know were definitely there. And the chances of them having not encountered them to some degree are diminishing to none, as we're going to cover.
Yeah, so let me get these last two super chats, and we're gonna hop hard into it. Phil, time to meet the old ones, the smartest idiots in all of fiction. Hey, I've got an idea. Let's create a species attuned to magic, try and fight chaos. What could possibly go wrong? Sounds great, Gwala Hupek. Gwala Hupek. But check this out. I made a species with a 2-to-8 sex ratio. Pretty neat, huh? CV4N. Didn't Krimlo used to make Pala for the old ones? He did. It's true. Okay, so the old ones. So like Andy said, the old ones, as we kind of know them today, showed up in 1997 with the release of the 5th edition Lizardmen book, which is actually a very fun book. If you haven't read it, you should find a copy. It's actually a really fun book. So a number of things that are very interesting about them in that book is that the 5th edition old ones are kind of similar to the ones we have today, but they don't really have names.
Chupek's mentioned in that one, as I recall.
There's only two old ones mentioned in the book, which is Tepek, who is not an old one anymore, because he becomes Tepok in later books. And then Chotek is mentioned.
Chotek, that's his name. Thanks.
But they both get a single half of a mention in a basically an item. They're like Chotek is mentioned in Lord Mazdamundi's items, and Tepek is mentioned in Lord Croak's items.
No, Chotek gets a box. He gets an actual box all to himself where it says that he might be the oldest of them.
Not in 5th edition.
That's 5th edition.
I read it cover to cover.
I can guarantee it's 5th edition because that's where I first took my notes for it.
Wasn't in my book.
As I recall, let me see. I'll see if I can find it while you're talking, so I can pull out what it says.
I mean, it is. I guess it's technically in a box, but the only place I could find him was in an item mentioned for one of the special characters.
No, he's in a small side box in the middle of the army list parts, as I recall, because I remember. Here we go. So the glyph represents the sun god Chotek. The sun disc represents the shining face of Chotek, which no one can look upon directly. The wings are the wings around it are the means by which Chotek soars above the world, and the rays are the divine inspiration descending down from his servants below, who are of course the Slan. Chotek is one of the old ones, perhaps even the oldest of that race. The glyph is used in its own to spell the name Chotek, and is also a sacred and powerful talisman in its own right. The glyph of Chotek is a favorite motif of Lizardmen standards.
There you go. I didn't read the army list section. I was too busy reading the actual text parts, but
yeah, they keep on hiding shit in stupid places. Anyway,
so those
Chotek's
are the two that are directly mentioned. 6th edition completely flips this on its head, and 6th edition gives us what I like to call the Big 7, and they will remain the Big 7 for pretty much the rest of time. And so it goes from being just Chotek and Tepek to Chotek, Tepok, Zunki, Itzel, Tlaxcotl, Huanchi, and Quetzal. So those are the Big 7. They were the ones that got sacred spawnings, so they had rules associated with them. They got a heavily expanded lore. They started getting a lot of magic items. And then 7th edition and 8th edition really just blew the hinges off. And old ones start showing up all over the fucking place, where a lot of them show up, and you'll get like barely any mentions, where there will be like a slight mention about maybe a title or a name, or they're associated with a very specific concept. And then one of the things I was actually relatively impressed with the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition book was that it actually did a pretty good job of just sort of gathering everything that was written in the army books and in some of the expanded other books like the Tome of Salvation and other Wolfram books, and just sort of slapped them all together. And then in a couple places, Total War Warhammer took them and also expanded them very, very slightly in a few places. So what are some fun things and to be clear, I'm not really going to talk about like the timeline as far as like what the old ones did in the planet, because we covered that heavily back during the Cataclysm stream. So I'm not even going to touch that. We
have too much other shit to touch.
Yeah. So some fun notes about them. One of the things that's revealed about the old ones pretty quick is that when the old ones come to the Warhammer world, it talks about how the changing of the world, particularly of Lustria, turning, because Lustria and the Southlands used to be part of the supercontinent, and they were together. And one of the things it talks about that is very interesting and kind of gives a hint about the old ones, and this leans very heavily into the old Slon concept that's talked about in the earlier editions, is that the old ones made Lustria the way it is because they wanted it to suit their alien metabolism.
Yep.
They wanted to make it comfortable for themselves. So they made it into a really humid, hot jungle, which leans super heavily into the old Slon. This will get dropped as you go into a later edition where they try and squiggle away that particular element and instead say, oh no, it was just conducive to the forms of life they were doing, and it was a natural consequence of them moving the planet closer to the sun. But one of the things that I find hilarious about the old ones that's brought up in maybe 5th, but definitely 6th, and it's kept throughout the rest of the editions that makes me laugh, is that the old ones are cat people. Because one of the things that's specifically talked about that is weird is that although there is an old one that is associated with Jaguar specifically, being Huanchi, who we'll talk about in a little bit, there is always the Jaguar standard or the Jaguar totem, which specifically mentions that all of the old ones deeply liked and appreciated Jaguars and found them to be pleasing in their aesthetic and the way they moved and everything. But the thing that makes me laugh every time is that it's very specifically stated that it's the pantheon of the old ones, not a old one. So all of them were really big into cats for some reason.
Yeah, totally. So just to make sure we're clear and to pull up Hawk's one, we're not saying that they are actually cats. We're saying that they're cat people. They like cats.
They like cats.
And this has been a core component of the Slann almost from the beginning, largely because of the original versions of the miniatures with their Jaguar warriors and similar. And as they moved into the later editions, all of those earlier footprints would then manifest as, yeah, no, all the old ones love their cats, to justify why they were still using the Jaguar standards and similar, where beforehand it was because they themselves took on totemic animal traits for their Slann troops. But that later became, we're keeping the standards, so we need a justification. They like cats.
Yeah, it's just great to me because the fact that there's an old one specifically about Jaguars, but they're still like, well, no, but all of them liked it. Huanchi was just a little more. It was just a little extra.
So funny.
So, brief things about the Great Plan that was interesting reading through the various editions is that if you go back to one of the things that actually kind of shocked me was that in 5th edition, it is very bluntly stated that the Great Plan is to defeat chaos. That's the goal. Beat chaos.
Yep.
And then when you go into 6th edition, they went so heavy into trying to make the old ones mysterious that they say nobody knows what the Great Plan is. Nobody has a clue. And they stuck with that until 8th edition. And then 8th edition came back and said, no. The point of the Great Plan is to create a race that can destroy chaos. That's the goal. Age of Sigmar, then interestingly, took this and ran with it that, yes, the ultimate goal of the Great Plan, period, end of story, beyond an argument, is to destroy chaos, is what 2nd edition and then 3rd edition run with. Because in 1st edition of Age of Sigmar, they didn't really know what they wanted to do with the old ones because 1st edition Age of Sigmar had no idea what it was doing.
Anyway,
so, 1st edition AOS said, oh, the Great Plan failed. It just failed. It's over, it's done. And there's actually a Black Library book where you read about how the Slann are destroying elements of the Great Plan because it's failed, and they're destroying all the sacred plaques and everything to basically just hide information from the great enemy, but there is no Great Plan. And then 2nd edition comes back and completely retcons everything and goes, no, the plan's still on. It's a little messier, but this was always the plan. Age of Sigmar was the point. Like, the old ones set up for this. And of course, that had to play into the way that Games Workshop was backpedaling, because they basically said that the realm gates, which allow you to teleport from the various planes or planets, you can almost think of them within Age of Sigmar, were made by the old ones. So if the old ones have if there's a bunch of old one tech floating around after the world blew up, you go, how does that make sense? And Games Workshop sat back in their chair and went,
oh crap.
That's it was the plan all along. Yeah. There we go. And then that got us there. Now, one of the things that I find particularly interesting is that as Age of Sigmar has drawn on longer, it has gotten more interesting because they've had more time to think about it. Where 2nd edition very bluntly just says the old ones are always planned for this. This is the Great Plan. It's messy, but this is the point. 3rd edition, though, makes it more dramatic and more interesting. Where instead of it just being that, oh, the Great Plan succeeded, it actually makes it a question of that some of the Slann in Age of Sigmar believe the Great Plan has genuinely failed. And the only thing that can be done now is to just kill chaos in revenge. Whereas there are other factions among the Slann that say, no, it hasn't failed. We just need to collect the parts that we're missing and we can get back on track. And there are another group that are very deterministic and believe that this is the plan. There's nothing that needs to be done. The plan will simply resolve itself. Like, we will do what we must, but the plan will happen, which I like a lot. And Age of Sigmar has just kind of gotten better as it drags on longer because it makes it a discussion. It makes it a story where nobody really knows the answer, which is good.
Yeah, agree completely. And I think that this is something that's also reflected through into Warhammer. It's not just from Age of Sigmar, because as we move back to the old world, they very much give yet again it was the plan all along line. But they also state in multiple places mysterious, uncertain, unsure. And it's quite clear from what we know of the Slan, and at least from the latest army list, that they also haven't got the foggiest what's going down.
Well, I mean,
and they themselves have different views. Different plaques have got different versions, and that means that the old ones in general are put back, even if the old world doesn't necessarily do it frightfully well, but they are put back on the pedestal of who knows what they were doing, and that's probably the best place to put them, rather than having the plan is clearly to stop chaos, or the plan is clearly to do this, or the plan has failed, or the plan has succeeded. Rather than say any of those are true, instead they say there was a plan, who knows what it was, we think it's this, and that's generally a better line to take.
Yeah, I mean, even the old world big book has this goofy moment where you read and it goes, yes, the old ones saw the old world and they go, oh, this world's going to be destroyed and fire and death, and something new is going to be born with it that has a really core part in our plan. And then you flip to the next page, and the first sentence on the next page is, unbeknownst to the old ones,
Totally.
There are things in the ether that are about to attack them. And you're like, all right.
Wait a minute.
Okay.
What? Yeah, totally. And I think that is broadly the best place for us to always assume is the case for the old ones. And that is, did they have a great plan at all? Possibly not. Did the coming of chaos come as a surprise? Every source pretty much says yes, except for one or two hints here or there. So I think then that we need to look at the old ones if we're trying to figure out who they are, and say that they probably were, much like normal folk, people with their own unique minds, their own unique plans, their own unique circumstances, and that contrary to the Lizardman view, where they often look at the old ones as this almost monolithic block. They all loved panthers, because I found a bit over here that says they like cats. Jaguars for everyone! Woohoo! So rather than view them as this monolithic block, we should instead view them as a whole host of colonizers who have come in with their own hopes and dreams and interests, their own scientific concerns, their own sorcery science mix-up, their own plans, their own, I'm going to make dwarves like this, woohoo! And they don't necessarily match or marry, but the Lizardmen who come after and look at all of this have literally no idea what's going down. And all of the great plan is a lovely conglomeration of everything they've managed to cobble together, rather than necessarily a great plan by all of the old ones. It seems more likely that one, two, multiple old ones had plans because of the horrors they were about to face, or passed those plans down to the Slan in some fashion in an attempt to try and save what they could from the absolute horror show that was the Cataclysm.
Yes. So now let's get into the fun aspect of one little actually side piece, and then I'm going to cut up on super chats, and then we'll talk about the individual old ones. So a couple of really fun things about them. One of the things is that one of the rare things you see show up in the Lizardmen book, which is actually really fun to look at from time to time, is there are mentions about old one tech that comes from not the Warhammer world. Mm-hmm. So one of the really big examples is, there's a couple of blades that we'll talk about, but the one that's not aligned with a specific old one is the Blade of Realities, which talks about how this is a weapon the old ones brought to the Warhammer world. It wasn't made on it, so it was made in a distant other place. And the thing that's fascinating about this weapon that the old ones eventually left behind for the Lizardmen is that it's a weapon that's constantly vibrating and humming, because it is not purely in reality. It is in reality, but it's, according to the Blade's description, it is in every reality simultaneously. And that includes the realm of chaos itself. So when it slices through something, it not only parts armor, but it destroys souls, it destroys entities, to the point that it was one of the only weapons in the game that ignored all saves. Like, ward save, you don't get it. Armor save, you don't get it. Just, you're dead. And it was bonkers. But it's a fascinating thing that the old ones were, we've talked about the gates, which, like Andy said, there's actually a hilarious thing about how there used to be two gates, and then there was only the north gate, and then they changed their mind and went back to having two gates.
Oh, it was such a pain, because when I was writing for the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the official line at that point was there was only the northern gate. And the online discourse about it was, oh, the lore has changed. There's only a single gate. And behind the scenes, it wasn't the case. I literally asked GW, and they're like, no, that's just what it says in those books. But all of the lore should be always seen through the view of the individuals who are being discussed. No, there's 2 Chaos Gates. And as we were writing that, the amount of fan backlash trying to say, you're using old lore instead of new lore. And it's like, literally not. It's just literally that book has taken that line, and it all came out because of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st edition, where in there they make it clear that one of the gates probably collapsed first, and that line got replicated by Nigel Stillman over into another book, and that turned into there's only a single Chaos Gate and it's in the north, and that became for a good few editions the actual lore, until it got pushed back from particularly a bunch of writers who were writing in fantasy roleplay, where they're like, but how does that explain all these bits down here? And the official answer eventually came back from the studio, oh, actually, no, we're going with 2 gates again. And that was handy because it made much more sense.
And then the intel showed up. They're like, actually, there's 3 gates because there's one in the middle mountains that we didn't tell you about.
Yeah, indeed. Well, but by that point, the lore made it very clear that there had been thousands of gates that they used for personal transport. Effectively, the realm gates were across Warhammer World already and closed down. They were already everywhere. It's just that most of them didn't work, and then the 2 great gates had collapsed entirely, and that whole network had gone down, and effectively the paths of the old ones were still out there. So that was the routes through all the realm gates that would have existed on the Warhammer World.
Yes, indeed. All right, Ryan Woodall, did any of the gods speak to the old ones? That's a great question.
Brilliant question.
That is, I would say, for someone in, I don't know if Andy agrees with this, but someone in my position, if I could ask any one question, that is like in my top 3, because it seems likely.
From my writing, the answer would be yes.
Yeah.
And my writing specifically, as in the contributions that I've made, the answer to that would be absolutely yes. And that was right from the writings from the Tome of Salvation, about that point onwards, when a particular version of the gods and the old ones was in place. But Games Workshop has since that point moved the old ones into slightly different positions. So I would argue from now that the answer is most certainly difficult to pin down. But I would still, if I was going down and writing that area with everything as it currently exists, my answer would still be yes, particularly given what happens in Ulthuan. Ulthuan in particular, the gods are in Ulthuan, and they're there pre-cataclysm. They are definitely there in all versions of the current lore. That being the case, you either have 2 choices. They are the old ones, or they are gods, and the old ones are aware of them. And then the next question is, this great, almost ridiculously powerful entity that is Azurin, is it going to be completely discrete from the old ones and never communicating with it? The answer appears to be definitely not, given what Azurin is and given what the other gods are. So the answer is probably they were communicating. And I would even argue that if you want to look for an old one's plan, the gods were part of it.
Yeah, I would agree very much. And we'll talk about this a little later about some specific old ones, but there are some deep links between several gods and the old ones. Like the Nehekaran Pantheon, they are like, with the old ones, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. The old ones being cats makes sense when you realize to push the old world off the table. How would I say? It's not that it would make sense. It's not what we said. Or sure, it was Jaguars, the cats, not Jaguars, the luxury cars. I feel like the old, great Mazda Mundi. Yeah, the old ones love their cars. Their luxury vehicles. Psych, the old one called Douch Vander, I don't know who that is probably why the slaughter is so confused. Just one more Chaos Invasion, Lord Croak, and then we can go to Tahiti. Oh, Dutch. Oh, Dutch. From what's that game called? The Western game. The second one. Oh my God, I can't remember what it's called. Someone in chat will remind me.
I wish you hadn't said that because oh crap. Red Dead Redemption.
Yes, Red Dead Redemption 2. Yeah, just one more Chaos Invasion, guys. Dino-Man.
Totally.
Good Lord, Dino-Man. His relationship between
Dino. Next time, Dino, think about an editor next time so that we can still see.
Okay, so Dino-Man. The way I will answer that, because we kind of just hit on that a little bit, and we also talked about this quite a bit back in the Cataclysm stream, and I think maybe the Kane stream, of that. The old ones are not gods. One thing that they hit heavy on that I want to reiterate is that the Slann, the modern Slann, know for a fact that the old ones were not gods. They were flesh and blood. They could die. They could be wounded and they could cease to live. However, they wielded powers that were so extreme that they basically came off like gods. But they are not etheric entities. They are physical entities.
And I think that's something that we need to keep as a relatively clean distinction. The gods in the Warhammer world are entirely etheric entities. Now, they can manifest in the real world. There are methods of doing so, but that doesn't change their fundamental nature. Where the old ones are this weird species that both crosses into, much like the reality blade, and passes through the aether, but are not etheric entities. They are flesh and blood. And they are not, as the Warhammer world defines gods, typically gods. But the word gods in Warhammer is an extremely amorphous term, and it is used in a variety of ways that don't match how most people think of Warhammer gods. So do be aware that we are using the most general use here, and that is an etheric entity of extraordinary power. And that is definitely not a description of the old ones. The old ones are flesh and blood who also overlap and move into the aether in a variety of ways that is not properly understood. And if you're desperate and wish to look at the Slann as their potential descendants, in a way the Slann no longer do. And that's fun because you get some clear differentiation there if you're looking for some. But
and of course, it doesn't, to be fair, it gets very confusing because the Skinks, Source, and Kroxigors treat them as gods and call them gods and think of them as gods, whereas the Slann go, no, that's ridiculous.
It's also worth noting, though, that the Slann originally weren't like that. The Slann originally, as in 5th edition area, they weren't sitting there going that they weren't gods. The Slann in the 5th edition are very similar to the Slann previous, and that's that the old ones are this unknowable set of gods, and they're almost worshipped like gods of the Lizardmen. That becomes very much a later development as we move through the editions, where the Slann, much like Croak, are given more and more and more awareness until they become literally like gods themselves. One of the things that I found most interesting reading through the Old World, for example, was just how much they dialed up the first generation Slann to the point that they were old ones themselves in terms of the capabilities that they were demonstrating, the awareness of the old one machines, how they were destroying not just thousands of demons, but billions with the great spells and workings that they had put into place. In some respects, there wasn't a greater selling point for the Slann being the direct children of the old ones than what the old world did, which I think the writers would be a bit disappointed with, because I don't think that's their intent. The intent is always to separate them these days. But definitely it was laid in such a fashion that could make you go, holy crap balls, the Slann are powerful. What?
Yep. All right, so let's talk about some individual, real quick. What are the Fallen Gates settlement north of Hexawaddle? So the Fallen Gates got a lot of expansion because of Total War. It's a very main focus. The Fallen Gates is revealed to quite literally be a closed gateway. It is an old one gate that is shut. And the whole reason that it features very importantly is because there are high elves if you're playing a Mazda Mundi campaign, it's chaos people attack it to try and corrupt it. And if you're playing Krokgar, it's that high elves are trying to tinker with it to open it, and for some reason
those elves
because elves just can't stop meddling with shit.
The meddling humans are one thing, but meddling elves are the worst.
Yeah, way worse. All right, so individual old ones. We're gonna start with something I found fascinating about the old ones. So a lot of the times when people think about the old ones as a pantheon, you get the impression that they're almost monolithic. But when you actually start diving into the nitty gritty, that's not true. And there's actually a hierarchy of gods. But what's interesting, and an opinion that's actually kicked around in 2 books that I actually really, really liked, is that there are some in-universe scholars that talk about that they have found evidence that they believe that originally the most powerful and the king of the old ones, the king of the gods, was Itzel, which is very interesting. Itzel is also known as Itzel, the ruler of beasts, is the tri-horned god. He is represented by a strange entity that has 3 horns coming out of his head. The fascinating thing about Itzel is that so as the ruler of beasts, he has dominance over the cold-blooded beasts of the wild, except for those times where he also has dominance over the warm-blooded beasts of the wild. But different authors forget that from time to time. But he basically is just the Lord of Beasts, all beasts. Now, one of the things that's suggested that I really find fascinating is that Itzel is, of course, who the Lizardmen turn to when they need to deal with all sorts of different creatures. So in order to be a Cold One rider, for instance, a Saurus must spawn as a blessed spawning or a sacred spawning of Itzel. Itzel has blessed them with his mark. They have physical changes. So they have extra dew claws. They have larger extra crests. And they are gifted at, and they even like emit like a special musk that makes like various creatures calmer around them. There are skinks that are spawned with Itzel's blessings that are more capable of mastering the Colchins, which are the big killer ostrich birds of the southern plains.
Which are well cool, by the way.
Yeah, oh yeah, Colchins are awesome.
Love those. And just to say that they're also dinosaurs. Don't get it wrong, because they're giant birds.
Oh yeah.
So it totally matches in.
Yes, which Age of Sigmar gave us models. Like they literally gave us Colchin riders, and they're so kick-ass.
So cool.
So one of the things is that it's believed and suggested that Itzel may have had stronger preeminence among the old ones, because it's suggested, and I actually fucking love this, that Itzel may have been the old one who was initially responsible for evolving the beasts into what we know as the Lizardmen. He created the Saurus, the Skink, and the Croxagore. But he falls out of favor. And one of the things that's talked about is that Itzel does not get along with the other old ones because he's too wild. He does not care for the great trappings of civilization. Itzel dislikes and is disfavorable on its temples, its choral arenas, whatever, being built within the temple cities. They are meant to be outside. His temples are supposed to be out in the wilds of the jungle. But Itzel, his name is a vague, when his name is extrapolated, it essentially means the first, which is a really fascinating idea that he showed up first, that he was the one who created the custodian race. But once his job was done, he was done. Because...
And I think that this is where we can start looking at these stories and viewing them as exactly what they are, stories. But these stories, much like most myths, have got some sort of grounding in fact. So it's very easy, for example, to find a creator entity and view this creator entity as king of the gods, because that is how most people view the initial creator, as the starting point, the true king, which is why you can see why Itzel would be given a certain preeminence. But then when you actually look at it as a species that's doing something, if this is the sorcerer scientist who is responsible for organizing the Lizardman species, then he's no longer this great, hugely important figure. He's just one part of a larger fabric of things that are happening within the Warhammer world in those early years. This individual god, this individual old one, is the one that is putting the great Lizardman plan in place, which in many respects makes him, to the Lizardmen, extraordinarily important, but to the overall old ones, perhaps a sideline figure. Could have just been almost the equivalent of some sort of intern who was then, put the intern on the Lizardman job, get them doing all that while we deal with the big shit at the back. Yeah, he's a bit mental, put him off at the side. He's a bit wild. He likes his animals a little bit too much. Put him over there. He's basically the zookeeper.
Yeah, it is worth noting that each of the old ones is associated with a city that is dedicated to them. They are the patron of that city. And he is, as the first, the patron of Itza, the very first city built by the Lizardmen and the first point on the geomantic web.
And I think it's worth reiterating, though, because it is very easy to go, well, that means he's the most important. No, that just is where he started work.
Yeah, his job, he got
where he was working.
Send out the wild guy. He's got to tame things first, and he wandered in there.
And I think that this is how we can start viewing the Lizardmen as a whole as a fragmented post-calamity species. Their version of who's most important in no way reflects who were the most important old ones at all.
Oh yeah, we're gonna I think I know who the most important old one is, and it's going to be a controversial take. I
wonder if it's going to be the same as what I think. Oh, this is exciting.
Yeah, so that's the general gist of Itzel. The other thing that's really important is if you keep in mind, remember that the vast majority of the species on the Warhammer world before the arrival of the old one were dominated by cold-blooded species. And he is the great tamer. He dominates cold-blooded creatures. That is his purpose. And what's fascinating is that his crest, the last big thing about him, is he's one of the big old ones that flies in the face of the idea of that we don't know what they look like. Because the Trihorn is not about a beast he's associated with, it's him. Specifically him. He is the three-horned entity.
But again, worth noting that view this through the lens of myth. This could be because he had himself a great technological device that sat upon him that looked like three horns, and the Lizardmen then translated that through to being quite literally a three-horned god, where he was not a three-horned god. He was an entity that might have had like the equivalent of 3 mechadendrites from 40k sitting off him as he did his work, because these are living flesh and blood entities that are in the Warhammer world that have been turned into gods by later iterations of understanding. So it's worth always saying that everything we know of the old ones is super fascinating but also super vague.
Yes, yeah. So the big thing I want y'all to do as we're going through these guys is allow your imaginations to run wild.
Yeah,
I'm gonna be
totally.
honest, I am personally very much of the opinion that the old ones were very much able to take whatever forms pleased them most, which made them so horrifically inconsistent due to a specific old one we'll get into in a minute. So next up, we have who in the modern ages is believed, and back in 5th edition is stated to be the king, the big bad, the boss of all bosses, Sotek, the solar god.
Sun.
So here is a really interesting thing. The old ones canonically have relations. So Itzel is not related to anyone that we know of. Sotek, however, has a twin. And Chotek's twin is Tlaxcotl, who's the god of the moon. And we'll get to Tlaxcotl in a minute. So Sotek, king of the gods, patron of Hexawatl, very obviously, the city of the sun. His domain, so the things that he is believed to have had influence over, are the sun, but also fire, and the very concepts of energy and warmth. He's, of course, represented by the sun. And unlike Itzel, many of the big seven, as we've talked about, have preferences for colors. Colors that apparently they deeply cared for, were deeply associated with them, to the point that when Lizardmen spawn blessed by these gods, marked by these gods, they will have these colors on their bodies physically as a part of them. And in Sotek's case, it's things like fiery orange, burning gold, and vermilion. Those are his colors. Furthermore, the sacred spawnings of Sotek, because we talked about Itzel, they have really big crests. They tend to be they prefer being with beasts. They have a special musk. They have extra dew claws, which allows them to literally hook their claws into the scales or the flesh of the creatures they're riding. So they hold on, because Lizardmen don't use saddles, hilariously, a lot of the time, because they don't need them, because their bodies are designed for it. But for Sotek, his lads are very energetic. They're aggressive. They're quick-witted. They think faster. They act faster. They react faster because they're fully energized. Age of Sigmar actually took this and ran with it in a really fascinating way by introducing a new creature called the Spawn of Sotek, which are salamanders. And the skinks that are spawned, I love the Spawn of Sotek skinks because they have these big frills that look like the sun coming out behind their heads, and it like absorbs extra heat. And allows them to withstand the extreme heat of being around salamanders, which is really, really cool. Now, the fascinating thing about Sotek, beyond the fact that he has a twin and that he's kind of viewed as a king across various editions. It's not just like one statement that comes up multiple times. So one of the things that is brought up that is super wild is that it is suggested so 4th edition has done some really funny things with a lot of lore tidbits. A lot of them are very fun because they're trying to, in a lot of ways,
just to make sure you're all clear, that's a fantasy roleplay, not a Warhammer fantasy battle.
Because a lot of the time they try to hold true to what Andy really set as the foundation of trying to tie as much stuff together as they can. And if you actually go read, I think it's Volumes of the Empire, or Archives of the Empire, Volume 3, there's a section on Sulcan. And one of the things that's talked about Sulcan is they just talk about the gods of law. And there's this mention about how, according to the people that worship the gods of law way back in ancient Telea, that the gods of law existed before chaos, and then when chaos showed up, the gods of law went off to fight them, and that all the gods of law were captured or killed except for Sulcan, who went and fought Khorne in a big old nasty fight, but Sulcan survives and escapes. And Sulcan is a sun god. And one of the things the book does is it very deliberately ties the idea that there are scholars. Now, this is an in-universe opinion, but it's still very interesting to think about, that there are scholars who believe that Sulcan is in truth Sotek, that this burning, fiery, almost hateful god of vengeance who just wants to burn away chaos, a very brutal god, is in fact a surviving old one. Who has evolved into this new form, which I would say is probably not true, but there is a shred of something behind it.
Yeah, so I have again, I think I'm going to take up in this stream a different stance each time. Because I think that'll make it nice to give us some contrary positions. And what I'll try to do is always ground it in reality. And so Sotek, which is, I think, appropriate for this stream, Sotek can focus on myth. So what we have here is an old one focused on heat, sun, who, interestingly, is too bright to even be looked at by anyone. That's his general myth. Such is his burning brilliance, which also makes it clear other old ones can be looked at directly by comparison. So let's just make sure that that little factoid is dropped in. But we have ourselves something that is associated with extraordinary heat. If we just pull away from the myth and look at it, this is clearly the old one who moved the Warhammer world in close to the sun. He is the one who is responsible for out there in his divine chariot, for want of a better description, for effectively affecting the greater solar positioning of everything. He brought heat to the Warhammer world, and he himself is thus described as, from the Lizardmen perspective, the bringer of heat, the great sun itself. Whenever they see that sun getting closer and closer and closer, that is Sotek. That is everything Sotek did. And his spawnings are all about harnessing that energy to the best outcomes. So you can see where those myths could have been grounded from if he was responsible for those parts. But if my job is to try and always bring it down a notch from the myth, or to try and explain the myth, I think the obvious choice here would be to say that Sotek is most likely the old one that was responsible for bringing heat to the old world. He's the god of heat. But if you want to flip it over on the other side, there is clearly here not just a tie, but such a strong tie to Actuary that it is almost impossible to ignore, because it is so exceedingly strong. Right down to the...
Talk about that in just
you're about to do that? Yeah, quite.
Yeah, no.
To the point that I would suggest they are linked.
Yeah, so an interesting thing about him. I will say that for those that like to have connections between the old ones and some of the gods, you may note that one of the really interesting things is that among the elves, Assuran's not associated with the sun, to my knowledge. He's a god. Yeah. So what's interesting is that the elves
directly, no.
Yeah, don't really have a sun god.
No.
Their gods developed much more, shall we say, naturally out there. But you'll notice that in Nehekara, interestingly, the king of their pantheon is the sun god. Just
and could easily be associated over to Azurin as well, if you wish to do so. He is the divine emperor that sits in the heavens, and that in many respects is the sun. So you can easily make Petra and Azurin very similar figures if you wish to do so. And similarly, that very easily marries over to Sotek as well, if you are looking to build them towards the gods. I don't think that's a link that is wise, but it's certainly fun. And more importantly, it is definitely one that in-world scholars would make, because some would pursue that like they were champing at the bit, because they would want to marry everything together, particularly humans, because humans love patterns. They love things to make sense. When they look similar, they go, they're the same. Look, that's a face in the hill. No, it's just a freaking pile of rocks. No, it's a face. That's a face. Sotek is Sulcan, is Petra. That's very human, because humans want to do that. Where I would suggest that behind the scenes, it's probably a bit more shades of grey and complicated.
Yeah. So, like Andy was talking about earlier, but I'm about to reinforce it like a motherfucker. Sotek was, to say that he was the master of Akshi is a grotesque understatement.
Yeah.
Sotek was also borderline the Smith god. The vast majority of the items that the Lizardmen have available to them that are directly connected to old ones were made by Sotek. The most notable, of course, are the solar engines. The solar engines, which are put on the back of Bastillodons, they do not do what you may think they do. Which you hear solar engine, you think, oh, they must absorb the rays of the sun and fire it. No. What they do is that the skinks have to chant a particular series of phrases that invokes Sotek. If they don't do this, it won't work. Sotek has to be specifically mentioned. And then they press an activation panel on the back, and it causes this crystal to summon up such horrific quantities of heat that it then blasts a laser out of the front that immolates everything in front of it. Just burns the fuck out of it. It is literally like it's an Akshi death ray, essentially. Now, one of the fascinating things that GW did that I will always love them for when they designed the solar engine is that the activation plate, if you go look at the mini, it has a plate designed for a 5-fingered hand to press and activate it. Lizardmen don't have 5 fingers.
Don't have 5 fingers.
They only have 4 fingers. It was not made for them. It was made for somebody else to use, and we don't know who.
Yeah, and I love that. So what we have so far is 2 of the old ones, one of which was quite clearly very closely associated with Gur, another of which is very clearly and quite closely associated with Akshi. So that's 2 of the Winds of Magic, already manifest through 2 of their most important old ones. Now, that doesn't mean they should be linked, because as humans, we like to make those links. Particularly when you look at what magic was before the cataclysm, and it was a more complicated set of affairs. There is going to be an old one
I'm about to talk about who is specifically mentioned to be linked with a certain wind of magic.
Yeah, quite. So let's move on, because I love Sotek, but there's not that much written about him.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll say, just to put into perspective, how many fucking items this guy has named after him. You have the Sun Standard of Sotek, the Gleaming Pendant of Sotek, the Burning Blade of Sotek, the Staff of the Last Sun, and the Scimitar of the Sun Resplendent. That is a lot. And they are genuinely nightmarish items. Like the Burning Blade of Sotek burns so hot that there is no armor it will not slice through. Like, it literally is a molten blade. It's a spooky ass fucking weapon. But let's move on to his twin. So Sotek, and this is reinforced in multiple editions, has a twin. He has a brother, though not just brother. It specifically says twin, and that is Tlaxcotl the Impassive.
Tlaxcotl.
And Tlaxcotl is the patron of Tlaxlan. And what's interesting is that we know the most about him because of this. Because back in 6th edition, they included a map of the city of Tlaxlan. And one of the things they did is that, according to myth, Tlaxcotl basically said a lot of stuff about the city. His instructions on how to build the city were recorded. Wait, did I say? Oh no, Tlaxlaw, not Tlaxcotl. Yeah, Tlaxlaw. Sorry. So Tlaxlaw, the moon god.
Sky Chariot god.
Oh no, I was right. Sorry,
I'm pretty sure it's not him.
Down wrong. Yes, Tlaxcotl.
Or her.
Oh Jesus, sorry. I wrote down something weird. Okay, so this is where it gets a little strange. So Tlaxcotl the Impassive is the twin of Sotek. However, he's also specifically mentioned to be the brother to Tepok, but not twin. So Tepok is said to be his brother, and then cousin is used, but the way they specifically phrase it, it doesn't seem like blood relation. It seems more like cousin of ability, because Tlaxcotl the Impassive is the Lord of the Moon. He is the lord of his domains are Manslib, and Manslib being up at night, Quan Chi is said to be his cousin because Quan Chi is the Lord of Night. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I don't believe they're genuinely related. It's more that their domains are related. As opposed to Tepok, who is quite specifically mentioned to be his brother, and Sotek, who is said to be his twin. Now, the interesting about Tlaxcotl is he's weird. Tlaxcotl is the twin-headed god. and he is represented as an entity that sees all.
Yeah.
And that the symbol that represents him is a snake that both ends end in a head. Which, fun fact, is an actual creature you can encounter in the Warhammer Fantasy World. That's
the Amphisbaena. Yep, the Amphisbaena.
Now,
it's from Greek.
Mm-hmm. So the big things about Tlaxcotl is that another thing I find fascinating about him is, according to the Slan of his city, Tlaxlan, the city of the moon, according to them, Tlaxcotl built the first building in Tlaxlan. The Great Temple of Tlaxcotl was built by his hands. He physically put it in place. It was not built by Kroxgor Skink or magic, but instead made by the Old One himself, and then he dictated the creation of the rest of the city, which is very unique. None of the other Old Ones that we know of did this. None of the other ones got their hands dirty like that, so to speak. He is, of course, represented by Manslip. It's the Skinks, which, whenever the Skinks believe anything, it is, to say that's myth is so beyond what, like, it is not, it's basically just not true, is the best way I can say it. However, the Skinks believe that the moon is Tlaxcotl's actual eye, that he plucked out one of his eyes and put it in the sky, and that is what the moon is. But what is known is that he was deeply affiliated with it. There is a strong relationship between him and the moon.
Yeah, I'm going to pop in here and say that it's always been in the back of my head that he was often up on the moon. That simple. That's where, and with everything we have with the Moon Empress,
exactly. I would say there's a relationship there.
And I'd also say that when we're looking at the
we're shapeshifters.
Yeah, quite. When we're looking at the twin stroke brother stroke cousin angles, I would suggest viewing that from the perspective of the species that we're dealing with here. So that's spawnings. They're all from the same spawning. They're all from the same group of birth, so to speak. That would make sense. So if we've got someone who's a twin, that's two old ones that look the same. When we've got ourselves someone who's a cousin or a brother or an equivalent, that's someone who's come from in the same generation, or are perceived by the Slan, for example, to be the same spawning. Let's call it spawning -1 rather than, or spawning 0 rather than spawning 1 for the first generation of the Slan. So these are old ones, so much, much, much older than, for example, the first generation Slan. So they're like generation 0 old ones, and they all work together because they're part of the same spawning. Perhaps a spawning for dealing with this particular world. And I know this is a very grounded, viewing them like Slan angle, but if you do that, it immediately strips away a lot of the language and makes it relatively clean.
Yeah.
And the language here is we've got a bunch of old ones that work together.
My favorite old one who's gonna fuck it up.
Because that's what they're there for. So we've got ourselves here an old one that was probably based upon the moon and was responsible for perhaps much of the geomantic shapes and the creation of cities and the positioning of them. Indeed, so important was that he dropped down and directly led the creation of one of them personally. And I think that's fun.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of fascinating items associated with him where, like, if the moon's in a specific alignment, they activate, which is really fun and cool.
Yeah, and if you're wanting to tie this to one of the winds, unexpectedly, this one probably sits over on the Gyron's side, because the wind of Gyron...
There's an important note about him.
Oh, good.
Which is that, so three quick things, is that his preferred colors, for those that care, because some people like to know these things, are the colors of yellow that blend into pale green, are his preferred colors. He was known, the Tlaxcotl, the entity, was known for being aloof and being able to observe harrowing events without reaction or needing to interfere. He was known for being indifferent. He is the cold-bloodedness of the Lizardmen made manifest, to the point that the Lizardmen attempt to emulate him by doing things like meditation and trying not to be involved. He is the concept of cold-blooded detachment, and reptilian temperament is the way. But the interesting thing is that the Slan of Tlaxlan swear up and down, which Adohi Tega, who's the lord of the city of Tlaxlan, is a second generation. He's very, very old. And according to Adohi Tega, the Slan were taught by Tlaxcotl himself how to read celestial bodies and how to see deep into the past and the future.
That's a thing of a mix-up in the winds, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. So anyway, running back in, the most obvious tie through to a single wind is Gyron, again, largely because of the color more than anything else. Now, Gyron is not an aloof wind that looks down from above. If you want an aloof wind, you're looking over at Heish. But controlling oneself and being aloof does suggest that one may have a character that's not like that. If one has to do something to be something, so I am doing something to become this, get over the Gyron, that sort of makes sense if you wish to do so. Particularly given that's what many of the Skinks and Lizardmen do, who revere that particular old one. But it's weak sauce, and it's not something I particularly dwell upon.
Yeah, what's interesting is, and we're going to talk about his brother in a second, is that between him and his brother, they are declared as the old ones of Azir, Flaxcodal and Tepok. They are said to be the old ones most deeply associated with it.
Well, you're up in space, so it makes sense.
Yeah, but they had different interactions with it, because Flaxcodal was focused on seeing the future of like doing that kind of stuff, dealing with the moon. Whereas Tepok, who we'll talk about now, is very different. So Tepok, the Inscrutable, also known as the Feathered Serpent God.
Love Tepok.
Yeah, Tepok is particularly weird when you're dealing with the physicality of the old ones, because it is said that the Quaddle was not his totemic animal, but instead is a manifestation of Tepok. That Tepok itself basically was a Quaddle. And Tepok is the patron of Zlanhapek, the City of Mist. He's one of two, because it actually has two patrons. And he is brother to Flaxcodal, as we talked about. And his domains are air, wisdom, and sacred places, which sacred places basically means places upon the geomantic web, the nexus points. He's, as I said, represented for the Quaddle. He represents protection from harmful magic and embodies mystical contemplation and otherworldliness.
Yeah, this is the Azir.
Yeah, he is said to prefer the color purple. And his sacred spawnings have very rich purple markings over their bodies and are instinctively drawn to places that are sacred, being nexus points and things like that on the geomantic web. Now, the fascinating thing about Tepok is that in 5th edition, he was called Tepek, but his name got changed a little bit. And that he is the Slann who, if I recall correctly, which I'm pretty sure, yes, he is the Slann that taught Lord Croak.
Old one. Taught,
He is the old one that taught Lord Croak how to master magic.
Yeah.
Cast it. The one that taught him to unbind it was a different old one. But when it came to controlling the winds of magic, to bringing spells into existence, Lord Croak was his personal student.
Yeah, Tepok's fascinating because Tepok is, again, a proper mix, amalgam of winds if you desperately wish to look at that, which I think makes most sense given that the winds didn't properly go till beforehand. Tepok has got the old mirror pools of Tepok as well, which view into the future. Tepok has been used as also a creator in various myths. I remember all the way back in the Companion when we had Tepok be involved with the creation of the bog octopuses as well, with the bog octopuses in particular having a greater part of the plan. The plan. Bob, Tepok did this. But broadly speaking, Tepok picks up this position of someone who is clearly on the more mystical side, clearly more involved with not just the sacred places, the geomantic web. Let's strip it back again. This is someone who is responsible for the deep magics of the Warhammer world and directly tied to it. And also looking outwards at the influences upon that world. That's one of the reasons why you've got the almost Azir-like looking out into what lies beyond aspects towards the future looking of Tepok. But also looking back into the past too. It's a difficult one depending on the winds of magic. As an old one, quite clearly responsible for the greater geomantic powers, because that is also taught to Mazdamundi in turn. Croak. Mazdamundi.
Croak. Yeah.
Croak. Thank you. Croak got the wrong one there. Croak in turn. So clearly someone who is not just there possibly channeling it, but actually perhaps an old one who is partially responsible for its creation.
Yeah, so two or three little interesting things about him. So for those who care, this makes a really interesting tie of that he's kind of the foundation of spellcasting. If you go by what the army books state very bluntly from a more blunt, historical perspective of Lord Croak learned magic from Tepok, and then Lord Croak is the one who taught it to the ancestors of the elves on Ulthuan, which shows this really fascinating relationship of where likely kind of high magic came from.
I think that's a fair point. I would argue in some respects that the true manifestation of magic, which you could argue high magic, and magic working at its best, so to speak, is going to be sourced through to something like the old one Tepok. That makes sense. It's the core magic that the Slann themselves focus upon, which is high magic. The other magics are almost bastardizations of this true magic. In some respects, it would be easy if you wish to mix up your lore parts to say that high magic, in many respects, is the true magic of the geomantic web when it's made properly manifest. Yeah, exactly. And although that mixes up the lore in places, particularly when you look at the winds of magic, how they manifest and what they do, I don't think in any way that it is incorrect. I think it's right. I just think that some of the writers haven't necessarily understood
I'll say, looking back at Tlaxcotl, that's actually not an unfair point that in different parts of the world, Ghyran does come across being very aloof.
And I think that that's an important component to understand with Ghyran. Ghyran is itself a very lusty wind, if you want to give it a single word. It tends to be a wind but that also is involved with the exact opposite, and that's controlling those things and not being affected by them. In the same way that most people think of Ghyran and they go, well, that brings life, isn't it? Ghyran's also rot, because rot in itself is life gone wild in a different way. So don't think of the winds as single things. If you do that, you end up getting almost caught in these traps of logic that the winds themselves don't in any respect.
Yeah, so a couple of fun little things for those that care. Tedoecho, the little 100-plus-year-old skink, is said to be a blessed spawning of Tepok. Also, that when you're dealing with some great powerful spells, rituals, or the crafting of artifacts, it is said that Tepok gives those individuals inspiration. That the skink priests, the skink artisans, the Slann, when they're in those deep contemplations trying to figure things out, if they do and they create something profound, it is said that Tepok is the one that leads them to it, that guides them to it.
And again, looking at winds, if you're looking for inspiration, that's generally dropped down onto his ear. That spark of brilliance that comes from the blue.
And there are two really interesting items associated with them. So first is the curse charm of Tepok, which is horrifying because it's this horrifying, hideous, leering face. And the way it works is the Lizardmen have it on a big thing on the battlefield, and enemy wizards see it, and Tepok's sorceries behind this item that was supposedly made by him blast this leering face into their mind, and they can't escape it. It manifests in their mind and basically makes them so anxious, so distracted that they fumble their spell casting, and it makes them miscast. Which, if you know anything about how dangerous casting magic is in Warhammer, is a very scary and effective method of dealing with a wizard. The second one, this one's fucking fascinating, is the plaque of Tepok. So this is a sacred plaque that is said to have been created by Tepok. And if a Slann has it, and this is stated in multiple editions, it's a really interesting item. A Slann that has it with him and is contemplating upon it, has his mind open to new possibilities, and, quote, allows them to mind meld with the spirits of the ancients and to use their knowledge. Which is fascinating. Of that, it seems to almost open a gateway to essentially the relic priests of the Slann, which is really interesting.
I'll also add the mirror pools of Tepok to that one. It's a rare one. which are worth mentioning purely because, not just because of what they do, which allows you to see the future when you're gazing into these great big mirrored pools, but because they often kill those that use it, which is worth bringing up because it almost certainly means that there's a deep well of magic in there, and to control that, you require, in turn, an ability to control that magic. And if you don't have it, you will likely burn out through simply trying to use it. Again, speaking to the deep mystical aspects of what the old ones were.
Yep. So the last two of the big seven, then we'll get caught up on super chats and everything. The last two of the big seven who are simpler than the others. So we have Huanchi. Huanchi, the Jaguar god, because Huanchi really fucking like Jaguars. Interestingly, actually no, there are three left. Interestingly, of all of the big seven, Huanchi is the only old one of that group who we don't know what city he was the patron of. It was the patron of, which when you hear about Huanchi actually makes a lot of sense. So Huanchi, the quote unquote cousin of Tlaxcotl, he has the domain. I need to stop saying he. It has the domains of stealth, hunting, the earth, and night. And Huanchi, very interestingly, is represented purely by the totemic animal of the jaguar. And Huanchi, as an entity, is said to have been known for silently stalking at night, hunting its prey across the earth of the world. Preferred the color black, and the Lizardmen believe that Huanchi gave them the gift of stealth and the ability to see in the dark. Now, that is not, those aren't its blessed spawnings. That's just the Lizardmen believe that's what Huanchi gave them. Yeah. As traits. Now, Huanchi is invoked by notably skinks before they go hunting for game or enemies. But some of the interesting things about Huanchi are that the rituals of Huanchi have to be performed in secret. They cannot be performed in open view. They cannot be performed in light. They have to be performed in secretive, dark locations, or they essentially just don't work, or something bad can happen. His sacred spawnings will often have a black mark, and they are very, supernaturally stealthy. But unlike other lizardmen, most lizardmen, because they're cold-blooded, they really like being in the sun. They will sunbathe. They absorb lots of heat. It gives them their energy. Not Huanchi spawning. They avoid light. They stick to the undergrowth. They stick to the shadows, to the night. And they can move through the jungle, the undergrowth, with a supernatural ability. To the point that they can move through the jungles without making any noise, regardless of how dense it is. Almost like the jungle itself is making way for them. The last really interesting things about Huanchi is that Huanchi is the only old one who had specifically mentioned that a portion of his essence remains in the world, which is the Huanchi's blessed totem. Huanchi's blessed totem is a standard that carries a portion of his boundless energy. And anyone who carries it basically gets these freakish, magically induced bursts of unnatural speed and energy. And the other thing being, of course, the charm of the jaguar, which not only allows a lizardman to move as fast as a jaguar, which is fucking terrifying, particularly when it's a saurus, but interestingly, those who see that lizardman carrying that charm, it looks as if they turn into one. Like they're like, as you see them between little spurts of shadow, little spurts of the undergrowth, you'll see a saurus running, and then the next moment you see a literal jaguar running, jumping, moving through the undergrowth. Huanchi is one of those old ones that, frankly, if the old ones could shapeshift, which I deeply believe they could, especially if you tie them in with the moon people, who we know were shapeshifters, Huanchi definitely spent his time as a jaguar. Like, he saw one, was like, I want to be that.
I want to be that, yeah. So fun things about Huanchi from my side, as we're grounding a little bit, quite clearly and demonstrably, lore of shadows written all over it. Even the skink priests that come from that particular spawning, they're going to be pulling out the lore of shadows also. And if we're looking for, well, where's the big, huge temple city? Probably hidden. No great surprise. There is a variety of fun ways that this particular city could be brought into the lore in unexpected places. races. Like, for example, you could easily have the whole jaguar aspect of it, which is both jaguars are not just black. Some of the jaguars are spotted also. Then they're called panthers. You can even pull that into some of the unexpected lore for the Knights Panther and what they discovered at the Eye of the Panther, which is a great, huge pyramidal mountain that sits on the edge of Araby. There's lots of fun things you could do with that if you wish to do so, and to the point that was originally intended to be written into the Middenheim book. That sadly did not happen, and Huan Chi was going to be popping up as effectively a deity, as understood by humans there, where they've got it all wrong, as is often the case with humans, because they just start believing whatever's put in front of them because they're humans. They're like, oh, that's a god. Literally can't help themselves. So cut a long story short, we have ourselves a clear old one here that is a manifestation to a degree of one of the winds yet again, but beyond the fact you've got the magic that is clearly being present here. We have ourselves, in terms of how this old one was working, someone who was teaching the various spawnings how to work stealthily within the confines of the known world. So we have ourselves another one who is directly interacting with the Lizardmen and teaching them stuff. And that has turned into, over the course of time, being the god of stealth and being the god of jaguars, being the god of this thing, where more realistically, if you're just trying to view it as an old one who popped along and was speaking to these early Lizardmen, was almost certainly the one who was teaching them possibly guerrilla war, different types of warfare, showing them how to interact on the battlefield in a different way. And that will have been going from the Slan all the way down. So we have ourselves probably a very interactive old one that's actually working with the various groups, which has turned in the course of time to, you can't talk to any old one, never spoke to that one ever, he's the one of shadows, we can't speak to any of them, they're all too brilliant and bright, except for the one that's too brilliant and bright. Clearly they can't be interacted with, and this one in particular was very fond of creeping around in jungles.
Yeah. Next is the old one who that I'm just going to tell you, he's one of the old Slan. He just is, which is Zunki, the water god.
Zunki.
So Zunki is the other patron of Zlanhapek. So him and Tepok share the city. And he is known as the Lord of Waters. His domains include the sea, rain, rivers, and the spawning pools, very importantly.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that's really fascinating about Zunki is that one of the things we note about his temple in the city of Zlanhapek is that he has a little temple. You know, a lot of the old ones have little pyramids and temples inside the various cities. But within Zlanhapek, which is his personal city, his patron city, in his temple, there's a map inside of it that shows all of the world's oceans. But what's interesting is that it doesn't match the oceans that exist currently, because there's like a couple of small issues with it. And the Lizardmen are constantly looking at that and trying to figure out if that's because the world fucked up and it's supposed to look like that, but it doesn't, or that's what it's gonna look like. We just haven't got there yet. Which is always just a hilarious Lizardman dilemma. He is totemic in that he's represented by various animals, being alligators and frogs, but he has a face that is his main symbol, and his is a slan face. Yeah. It's a big angry frog face, and he prefers the colors of turquoise and green. His sacred spawnings have sea green markings. They have webbed extremities, so they have like webbed fingers and toes. They have a very strong affinity for water, heightened agility, which, remember, old Slan, when you're dealing with like their rules and stuff, the fact they would jump, they were very athletic. The other thing that's really cool is that the blessed spawning of Zunki have gills. It's hidden in the flaps of their skin. And supposedly, Zunki also grants very, very keen eyesight to those that are blessed by him. But the last really interesting note about him that really makes me think of like the old Slan from the early editions, which or like especially the Slan Lords, which were really scary melee characters. Because they were these, bipedal toes that could just obliterate your ass in melee. Is that Tezuki is one of only two old ones whose personal weapon is still around.
Yeah.
So the revered blade of Tezuki was wielded by him, supposedly, by it. And this weapon is made of a very hard black material that is not from this world. It is completely and utterly unbreakable. And there's a note that it has, I wish I would love to know the story around this, but it survived the most intense dragon fire utterly unscathed and was still completely icy cold to the touch. And when swung, it literally hums. Like, it makes noise because it's splitting things. It was super gross in tabletop because not only did it just completely ignore all forms of armor, but it still gave you a strength bonus, because why not?
Because why not? Yeah, fucking hell. Okay, so here we have the clear analog for Gyron. We have clearly an old one that was responsible for the spawning pools, was probably responsible for establishing the new forms of Lizardmen life in the first cities. We have an obvious choice here, and we also have a clear, if you want to go with the old ones are the Slan, here's your link. And a link that stands pretty much the test of time as well. Now, does that mean that they're not shapeshifters? Does that mean a whole bunch of other things? No, it just means that if you want to have yourself a nice clear, the big bloated Slan that we have nowadays are linked directly through to the old ones. We have an option for doing exactly that because he is the frog-faced god. Yep. And that's fun if you wish to run down that side.
Also, just a hilarious random note about him. Zuki, for some reason, has totems that pop up in the old world like you would not believe. They find Zuki shit everywhere in the old world.
Yeah, which is a fun one. I
don't know why.
He pops up in Norska. He pops up over in the Empire in a few places. Yeah, it's a fun one. I think that coming up with a reason for your own games may be worthwhile, but probably want to tie it through to Water if you do. Again, Sacred Pools.
The last big of the big 7 before we'll get caught up on super chats and everything, and then we'll dive into the remaining 18 that are much more minor. So we have Quetzal. Quetzal, the protector god. So he is the patron of Quetzal, which is unfortunate because it's a fallen city now. Very heavily infested by Skaven. Got infested by snakes. Skaven came back. Teto Echo dropped a fucking comment on it. And now it's just a smoking ruin that the Skaven are slowly trying to re-excavate. So Quetzal is the only one of the big 7 who is explicitly noted as a warrior god, unlike the other 6. And Quetzal is represented by a spiked glyph that supposedly represents the tough scales of the Lizardmen's hide.
Spurs.
He embodies, and his domains feature resilience, defense, and protection. He is a warrior god that taught lessons of stoicism and resistance to force, and his glyph is found marked on all of the walls surrounding the various temple cities. The other big thing about him is that his sacred spawnings, very, very thick hides, very thick scales all over their body, bone spurs coming out of their arms, and other bony protrusions. They're known for being like really, really exceptionally resolute. However, they're also known for being stubborn. Even by Lizardmen standards, they're very slow to change their stances, both mentally and physically. Interesting thing about Quetzal that kind of shows his importance is that all Temple Guard, all of them, are blessed spawnings of Quetzal.
Yeah. Interestingly, as I recall, now he's running back in the back of my memory now, that the Temple Guard themselves are often deemed to be the children of him in general. As I recall, I think that was, I can't remember which White Dwarf article I read that in, but I read it recently in that I was running through a bunch of old White Dwarves about 2 months ago, and I remember passing go that going, I'll remember that for next time. So it's out there somewhere, and all of them were deemed to be not just his spawnings, but his direct children, which again, if you're going with the our frog people, doesn't really match, but definitely gives you a fun story. We have ourselves someone here who appears to be basically laid down on defense, interestingly. For all we have the warrior god, we don't have the lightning attacks or the gorilla attacks. What we have is the build-up of big bony spurs, the thick hides, the defensive temple guard that are there to defend the temples. So it appears that we've got ourselves some sort of castellan. That'd be one way to potentially describe this old one. This is someone who is looking at the works that are happening in the Warhammer world and going, we need need to also defend these from outside attack. So we've got our temple guard that he's responsible for creating. We've got the very nature of the lizardmen that he is put into the spawning process, which are all defensive and designed to hold against incoming damage. So again, if we're looking to try and build the stories, we have ourselves the old ones here, considering more than just simply being sorcerer scientists who are working with the world. Not only are they spreading outwards, but they're also considering the potential of attack. And we know that's the case because the dragons went to war with them.
I was going to say, I mean, Suzuki's blade mentioning the Dragonfire, you almost wonder if Suzuki itself literally fought a dragon.
And it seems to be a very likely outcome because the dragons went to war with them, which means that they will have been suffering attacks well before the cataclysm even came round. So it appears that Quetzal in particular was part of that process as they were changing the jungles around them and building defensive fortifications. That is what that old one was largely working with.
The other thing that's very interesting is Quetzal has a very unique item because all of the old ones, their items are like very specifically like made in their image or were wielded by them or came from the stars or other weird shit. Quetzal is the only item that's very mundane, which is called the Aura of Quetzal. And what it is it's basically just like a string necklace made of like beaded shells, feathers, and bones. But it has the blessings of Quetzal, and when worn, it causes weird multicolored lights or air to kind of appear around the person wearing it. And from a functional rule standpoint, it basically gave them the blessing of the lady, where like if something particularly strong came at them, it would turn it aside or make it miss in a weird way. But it's also weird because it's a blessing in the sense of like it's mundane items that seem to take on some kind of trait.
There's also the flawless heartstone that the Dread Saurians could wear. That popped up in one, which is the huge thing which had that's got the glyph of the face of Quetzal sitting on it. But again, defensive. It's a large defensive artifact designed to hold out damage and then give some too. So yeah, you get a very strong idea of this particular warrior god. If I were to title him as a single thing, it would be a Castellan. He appears to be the person who is responsible for the defense of the great civilization that had been built pre-cataclysm.
Good Lord, there are so many super chats. Okay, let's so that's the end of the big 7. So we're gonna get caught up with super chats and then we'll jump through the minor ones.
While doing that, I have a very small thing I have to do, so I'll be back in just a second.
Okay, great. So I'll just kind of let's see here. False Apprentice. In my view, Warhammer Fantasy Battle was the dev room / backup for the War in Heaven, coming through the webway to test their creations and preserve them in the future. This only says, Slanesh and 40k, first generation Slane being off-world, old ones, seeding humanity, the warp connecting both settings, orcs, and the GP. What would GP be? I'll make sure Andy reacts to this as well. That's an interesting theory. I think it's a weird thing, right? Because it's like the whole concept of that when 40k originally started, it was more of, this is the Warhammer Fantasy universe 40,000 years in the future, as opposed to the Warhammer Fantasy world is a planet somewhere in 40k, which came very, very quickly, but that came later. I definitely would say that there are individuals who would agree with this. I personally wouldn't, but I could see it working. You'd have to wiggle some things around, but I could see it working.
On one point, 40k was always from the beginning the future of our world.
Oh, never mind. Then it is.
Yeah, but it always was. Yeah. It's a minor point, but
yeah. But I would say that if you wanted to make this work, you can. I don't think it was necessarily the intent, though. I would not be surprised if there were several writers at GW who did feel this way. Andy, just to catch you up on, he basically said that
I heard everything.
Oh,
yeah, totally heard everything.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got my headphones on. I can do things on the side and still listen. Multitasking like a boss. I'm an old one.
You can be and listen at the same time.
I can multitask. Right. So, you could argue this in that the Slan do indeed their empire spanned not just space but time, meaning that you could literally have 40 old ones just pop up in Age of Sigmar, and that would totally work with their empire. It would not contradict what they are, because they work through space and time, which means that you could argue that the Warhammer world is their little petri dish where they're building shit to deal with.
Where's my space skaven, GW? Where's my fucking space skaven?
But if I was to tie the two of them together, I would much prefer that they worked contemporaneously, which means that approximately 10,000 years ago, you would need to have the birth of Slaanesh. And that would make for a great cataclysm source event. It would broadly work. It would fit 7,000 years after that. 3,000 years after that, the end of the cataclysm. That would kind of work. And that being the case, I don't think that would make for the best answer. I think I'd go with something else, but I shan't go into that because we could do that in another stream, perhaps.
If you wanted to make that work, you could. I will say that. Ryan,
you certainly could if you wish to do so.
Connection with the Beastmen. No, because he was already gone when the Beastmen showed up. But if you wanted to fuck around with that as like an in-universe theory by some weird scholars, that would be hilarious.
Definitely. One of the big mistakes is to make all of the scholars in game say things that are true. They get things wrong all the time, and that should be the case. The Beastmen are specifically called out, as are the Skaven, as being effectively creations of chaos. And by that, I don't mean that they came from the Chaos Gods. I mean they came from a world once chaos has arrived. So they are post the removal of the old ones.
That does remind me, there's a really funny note that I heavily rolled my eyes at, though it's fun, and you can play around with it. There's a very deliberate mention in the 4th edition Lestria book of a particular location. I think it's the Stone Sentinels of Shetty. No, it's not the Stone Sentinels. I forget which. It's like these 4 floating pyramids. But one of the pyramids, they're like, oh yeah, there's these 4 floating pyramids, and each of them is for a specific old one. And one of them is for an old one, but a lot of the carvings have been like messed up over age from like weathering, all that stuff. But it's like, oh, there's you can make out the image of a bell, and you can make out this other thing, and it's very clearly the Horned Rat as the stranger, where it's like it's a hooded figure and there's a bell, I think is what it is. And it made me laugh. But there's stuff like that you can play around with. Here's a tinfoil theory. Humans were test subjects that escaped rather than part of the old one's creative design. Think about it. Unlike virtually all their other creations, they're short-lived, far more sensitive to mutation and corruption, have difficulties wielding magic. The old ones thought little of humans until they were noticed. Nahakara and saw potential in them. It's probably wrong, but I like the theory because it makes the old ones look so much valuable for what. So, interesting, what I'll say, if you go back to 5th edition, when 5th edition is talking about the creation of the various races, it talks about how the old ones kind of more like found the various races and then uplifted them a little bit compared to like later editions, which makes it seem more like they genetically engineered them. And in the 5th edition book, the way it talks about humanity is kind of hilarious, because basically what it says is that the old ones saw humanity and were like, and were just not impressed and kind of ignored them for a little bit. But they saw how resolute and adaptive humanity was. Like, they kind of watched them from a distance for a while without messing them. And at first, they totally wrote them off. But as the humans continued to adapt and survive, the old ones went, maybe there's something here we can work with. And they started messing with humanity, and then everything blew up.
Yeah, the timeline around the entirety of the creation of the species as we understand them is a bit wobbly. Because repeatedly you will have a writer say something like, and because of the cataclysm, they realized that they had to make the species a little bit more magic resistant and stuff to chaos and the like. So that's why we got the ogres and the halflings. And then you go, but all of that must have happened before the cataclysm. What are you talking about? Humanity and when exactly it was uplifted goes through a different write-up with almost every single writer.
Yeah.
With some of them claiming that it happened at the end, with some of them claiming that it didn't happen, with some of them saying that they were the best evolution of the old one's plans. So the answer is you can pretty much do anything with it and not contradict the overall intent.
Yeah, the old world actually tries to give vague specific dates. Like I know it says that the ogres and halflings are like 100 years before the cataclysm. Okay, I'm gonna really fast rush through these because I'm just looking at the time and I just want to get through the rest of these old ones. So I'm gonna put the pedal to the metal
crap.
Here.
We've got a lot to cover yet.
Stegodons were considered sacred to Itzel because of the 3 horns. Cheer. Sometimes they are. Stegodons have a sacred place within Lizardmen stuff.
Great.
And plus they're the OG dinosaur for the Lizardmen, so they have a whole thing. Could Chotek's pictured as a hexawaddle explain why it's much further north than most of Lister, because it's basically on the equator and as close as possible to the sun? That is very sure.
Yeah,
sure.
I go with that.
It's certainly exposed to the sun more than anywhere else, so I would say yes. Hello. Bislot, just got home from work and I'm watching the big TV. Glad to see everyone's alive and well. Well, thank you for making it. Great to see you. Bones, if the old ones have a connection to Nehekar and Pantheon, is that why they are often or depicted as bestial, such as Thra, Asaf, and the other, such as Bothcats? I will say, I think this is something that me and Andy would disagree with, because I would say emphatically yes. I believe that, I don't think anyone would agree with this at all, but I'll just tell you my theory, is I genuinely believe that the Nehekarian gods are humanity seeing the old ones and worshiping and believing concepts they associate with the old ones, and that led to the creation of certain gods that look and act like the old ones, but they're not, because they were made by humans. But they're in the image of the old ones.
I don't think that is necessarily bad as an idea. And I definitely think you can run with it. It hits a couple of stumbling blocks with just how gods work in Warhammer, but they're stumbling blocks I think that can be easily jumped over with a little bit of thought. And lastly, in terms of the animal aspects of it, I would broadly say that's humans being human.
Because totemic animals are all, it's just Nehekara. The best way I can describe it is because Nehekara is like a dead culture, you tend to get, they're the animal god, because those totemic things are the only things that survived all these thousands of years. Whereas if you go to the Empire, they're modern gods, so their totemic aspects are not necessarily front and
center. It's still wolves, and it's still deer, and it's still all those animal parts are still there.
Yeah. Phil, could the old ones have created the World's Edge Mountains serve as a way to keep the dwarves out of their hair for a while, like they did with super serious secret business, much like they created Ultron for the elves? And why am I reminded of my parents that give smartphones to their toddlers to shut them up?
So the answer to that is specifically no, in that all of the references to the dwarves and the old ones are something along these lines. The dwarves came out of their bits and wandered around a bit over there. The old ones came along and went, hey guys, here's some extra stuff. Now that goes through a host of different iterations, but the story's broadly the same. It's not that the mountains were put there for them, it's that the mountains were there and the dwarves were in there, and the old ones at some point make contact, influence, and change.
Yeah. Ravan, I'm behind as I started watching hours so late, so I'm not sure if this answer. Would the elven gods be able to tell people about the old ones? Could they? Probably. Would they? Probably not, for some reason. I'm sure they have their reasons.
Yeah, so reason number one is because Games Workshop doesn't want old one details to be heavily spilled outside of creations from the studio, meaning that all of the various possibilities where we could add tons of extra stuff don't get done. But could they? Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say, like, if you wanted to play around with it, the idea that your PC in the Tower of Hoeth encounters some crazy-ass tome, and you're like, oh shit, like Hoeth, like, there's something about how Hoeth talks about the old ones, I would be like, yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah, and even having the Book of Days having significant extracts about that makes sense. The Book of Days itself, it says on silver chips they came. It speaks directly to the old ones and where they came from and what they did.
Man, it would be really interesting if we ever got Quayian's thoughts on Tlaxcodal. I wonder if the shapeshifters were created by the old ones, or if the shapeshifting is somehow connected with the old ones' ability to change the mold of the species. Yep, that is a question.
That is a good question.
I would agree. I would love to see some notes there.
Yeah.
Ryan Woodall, plot twist. The Moon Empress simply is an old one. Poor Dragon Emperor got catfished.
I don't think that's as heavy a plot twist as many would suggest. The moon, what's happening on Mansleep is a plot, and it's a big one. There is stuff going on up there with its crazy birds and its moonfire and all the rest of it that directly ties back to the time of the old ones. And this is absolutely something they will have been aware of. Now, does this mean that the old one that was up there, we've already passed one that almost certainly was up there frequently, was building an extraterrestrial colony of sorts up there? Does this mean that they are ancestors of old ones? Does this mean they're creation of old ones? All of that is unanswered, but could certainly make for an interesting story.
Yep. Digitested Pichu. So what you're saying is Teflon had a beak since the Kodal's manifestation of him. Get out. You're banned. You're not allowed to come back here. I'll hit you with my car. Sean Steele, if Croak taught the elves, but the first generation of Slaanesh are so alien, the skinks have to guess what they are saying. Does that mean the old elves could have possibly understood the old one? So hilariously, it's not just the old Slann. It's literally any of the Slann. The skinks have no fucking idea what the Slann are saying most of the time.
Yeah,
because they speak a higher dialect essentially of Saurian that's not great.
But this is a story that could be interpreted in multiple ways. For example, it could have been the mixture of the elven gods speaking with the old Slan, or the very first Slan, first generation Slan. Doesn't need to be the elves directly. So there is multiple ways this could be interpreted. So the answer to that is we are unsure.
Yeah, there was a really cool cultural exchange program where Croak was hanging out at Hoeth's house all the time.
Hey, Hoeth, how's it going?
Well, will you discuss the accused old one, the Shaper? I did earlier. The Shaper is basically believed to be the Great Horned Rat, essentially. Leading up to the events at what happened at Tylos. In real life, jaguars have the strongest bite of any big cat, and sometimes even hunt caimans, relatives of crocodiles. Do those blessed by Haunchi have a stronger bite? They don't in the writing, but if someone was smart, they would. Because that's just someone not knowing that, and they haven't updated it for. Because to be fair, sacred spawnings were a really awesome rule that Games Workshop gave us in 6th edition, and then they went away forever.
Yep.
Because Games Workshop was like, oh, those are hard to balance. Becca Dixon, tuned in late, but I'll catch up. Are there any unique descriptions, specific old ones? Yes, and we're about to get to some really cool ones in a second. Barathi, could Zuki have been the one who moved the continents, expanding the map and the totems found in the old world, perhaps? That's possible.
Yeah.
That's very possible. Yeah. Space Skaven are the Imperium-clad Pestilence are the sisters. Warlord clans of the Imperial Army, Clan Molder is Space Marines, and Great Council's the Imperial Lords. You made some fascinating jumps there, but no comment. So, is the timeline as wobbly as Andy's computer? Yes. Especially his old one. Rig. We're getting to Rig. Okay, so
good old
minor old ones. Let's go. We got 30 minutes. All right, we're gonna blast through these. These are much simpler, which is great. So going down the list in alphabetical order. The first one, who's actually quite interesting, is Axelbannern. So Axelbannern, which is the least old one sounding old one of the bunch.
Very much so.
Its domain is the firmament, very specifically. So the placement of the stars in the heavens.
Just like to say, hate that name so much. I mean, that should not have passed editing.
Yeah. Hilariously, he is the patron of Axolotl, so they should have just called him something much closer to Axolotl. But nonetheless, he's the patron of one of the cities we know. This old one, we're not exactly sure how, but had a very deep connection to the stars and their placement in the heavens. To the point that it actually has modern-day skink priests from the city of Axolotl. And the priests there cover themselves in charcoal, and for specific rituals, they cover themselves to charcoal and make themselves very black, and then they mark out points to create constellations and stuff on their scales in order to perform certain rituals. Very cool, awesome. And the grounding thing, as Andy likes to do, probably the old one that taught them about constellations and the stars. Moving on.
Yeah, sure.
So next we have Kashwatan. So this guy's interesting. Kashwatan's domain is, and granted, I'm gonna butcher these pronunciations. Try my best. So this is it has the domain of predators and stillness. Now, what's interesting is this is the only old one. It's not the only one. It is a old one who very uniquely is almost kind of implied to still be around, but it's a very freaky old one because it is said to embody the perfect stillness before a predator strikes. Very esoteric concept. However,
clearly never seen a cat whose back limbs.
What's noted about it is that it says the Lizardmen believe that Kashwatan stalks the deep jungles to this day, and when it passes, all of the beasts in the jungle immediately go silent, and the wind dies. Everything becomes completely and utterly still, and the Lizardmen go, "Get the fuck out! Get the fuck out!" Which is interesting.
Yeah, that just feels like, again, grounding it in the remnant of a story of one of that particular old one's artifacts or equivalent.
I like that he's implied to be. I like that it's implied to be unfriendly. That's the thing I find interesting about it.
Particularly because it's potentially dangerous to the Lizardmen who are around. Better name than the previous one, but again, as additions go, doesn't really do much for the old one's story, so not the much that makes me super excited about this one. There's not much. There
are some cool ones in here.
Yes, there is some cool ones in this long list, and I'm looking forward to those ones. But this one, it's a big heavy meh for me.
Yeah. Next up, we have Konalsha. So Canalsha, spelled with an X, has the domain of concealment. And this one, it's not specifically stated to be, but it is deeply favored by chameleon skinks. So I think it is very likely that chameleon skinks are blessed spawnings of Canalsha. And it's also very likely that because of that, chameleon skinks used to only spawn from one city, that being the city of Ash Pahawks. So it's very likely that it is the patron of Pahawks as well.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the story that you'd be looking for that particular old one to be attached to. And the fact that it wasn't in the write-up, again, just leaves you with a editor!
Yeah.
Go edit!
Favored by chameleon skinks. Oh, well, do they have a city? Oh yeah, Pahawk. So should there be a connection?
Yeah, and that's something that that's an example where in the book it should have been expressly made, because it makes a better tie for that old one. Didn't happen though, so we've just basically got a name dropped in that does very little.
Yeah, so this is one of the old ones that got expanded on thanks to Total War, Inhamex. So Inhamex has the domain of righteousness. And Inhamex is very deliberately remembered by the Lizardmen as being an angry motherfucker who would get extremely enraged when the great plan was disrupted in some fashion, to the point that the Lizardmen believe that if the sky ever looks like it's burning, it's because Inhamex is enraged and that something has happened in the world. So this has led to that when the skies burn, as the Lizardmen put it, they take action. They go on the aggressive, because they believe that there's an old one who is genuinely enraged and could theoretically punish them if they do not take action. So he was the manager when he was around. Next up is an actually really interesting one, Potek. Potek has a very specific domain, which is domain of protection against the supernatural. Potek was said to be the emissary of Tepok, so he was one of Tepok's little acolyte guys, and was notably his teachings, his wisdom was designed to be used against the undead, specifically, to the point that when Lord Croak died and the first relic priests were created, all of those mummy wrappings on the relic priests are inscribed constantly, like all along its length, with the runes, the symbols of Potek, to protect their spirits from other spiritual entities, from other undead type entities. And very interestingly, in addition to that, he also was the one that taught Lord Croak how to unwind the winds of magic, how to pull at threads on spells so that they would completely collapse and fall apart with minimal effort.
Yep.
And what's fascinating is that Potek, just to very, very bluntly, Potek is basically seems to be the old one who was an expert on dealing with etheric entities.
That's what I was going to say.
He was the master of bopping them on the head.
And this is one that actually feels like a good, strong addition throughout on the minor ones, in that we've got clear purpose, clear ideas, and clear outcomes for it. And it appears to be a clear entity that was dealing with the immaterial part of the realms rather than the material part.
Yep. Next is everyone's favorite, Quaddle the Obscure, who is known for no one knows anything about it. That's it.
Yep.
Next up is Quetli. So Quetli is
warrior.
He's a warrior god. He's the second warrior god we've talked about. Quetli is the protector of the true way. And it is a warrior god that represents the concept of leading the Lizardmen to their objectives. But what's fascinating is it's meant in a literal sense, in that it leads you to the place you're trying to go, but also in a figurative sense. So it leads you to an idea, a resolution to a problem, which to me kind of almost is reminiscent, once again, going with the grounding Andy talked about, of an old one whose job was to teach the Lizardmen how to quite literally solve problems.
Or the plan.
Or the plan.
And possibly, was possibly the creator of the Great Plan, or the creator of the Great Plan as the Slan see it. So it's very possible that he was nothing more than well, how can we best describe this in a real world fashion? Someone who's attempting to resolve future problems.
Yeah. What I find interesting is that it's specifically a warrior god, because that implies an interesting
chaos.
Yeah. That this is the stomp out.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next up, because of alphabetical, the big one. My favorite, because she messes with everything.
Rig. Yay!
Rig the Outcast.
Goddess Rig.
Recorded and said on plaques related to her to be a tall humanoid female figure who has a sacred shrine on Amazon Island, which is just outside of the river Amazon, right where it empties out into the ocean. What's interesting is that the Lizardmen have notes that record Rig, and the Amazons also know her by this name as the mother of Caliph. The Lizardmen, though, are deeply confused by this because they don't understand what it means. Because the Lizardmen do not have a sex. They don't have a gender. The femininity, the idea of a mother, is a genuinely alien concept to them, so they don't understand it. But what I find so fascinating is that the Lizardmen's records, their plaques, quite literally know her title as the Outcast.
Yeah, she's brilliant. Now, she's particularly brilliant because she is ultimately the source of the Amazons, and the various plots and seeds that are dropped down about the Amazons. Now, in some stories, we have the Amazons laced through to potentially Skeggy and potentially the Norse, but in others, they are quite literally of divine origin, and that divine origin is divine. The goddess Rig, and Caliph being the very first of the Amazons and the mother of all Amazons. And that is just brilliant because we have ourselves potentially Rig with the least let's say the least Lizardman-like name you've ever heard, because outside of the Lizardman sphere of influence. And we have ourselves an entity that, whilst, yes, it is spawned from the very first writings of Warhammer, when the Amazons were put in place, and they, in some respects, were also the children of the old ones. We have ourselves a different, uplifted example of a species directly played with by an old one, the Amazons, used by an old one, the Amazons, for a particular outcome, the Amazons, and as later writers have come along, they've gone, well, this doesn't fit, let's call it the Outcast, and we'll still have it. Woohoo! So it's popped up in relatively recent White Dwarfs, like in the 300s, so not that recent, but relatively...
Well, I mean, it's in the most recent army books as well.
Oh, there we go.
8th edition, 7th edition, she's there.
Yeah, totally. And Rig has been there from the beginning, from the very first Rig adventures that were placed in like White Dwarf about 90, I guess. I can't remember what number it was. One of you out there will probably recall. And it's just great with the great shrine of Rig still being a part of the game.
And some other really interesting things about her is that, A, I love the idea of her being the outcast because it really helps cement the idea that there were factions among the old ones. There were old ones that didn't have popular ideas. There were old ones that maybe were, not getting along and had they had disagreements, which makes sense and makes them more interesting. Now, 4th edition did something wild, which I'm just frankly read on, is that, so in the Archives of the Empire, Volume 3, when it's talking about the Druids in the Old Faith, it mentions that modern scholars in the Warhammer world believe that there is a connection between the mother of the gods, known by the old ones as Goidarin, who is noted in this faith as being a distant and unrelatable figure who journeyed across the skies in her silver chariot.
Yeah, so there's the clear link there, obviously, through to Rig as well, because Rig created... Now, here's one that, to me, really interests you fans of obscure lore. Rig falls in love with an elf goddess. Or god, depending which version you go with.
Old ones and the elf gods bone, okay, here we go.
Yeah, and they bone... And through their boning, they create the first of the Amazons, who's a 9-foot tall... red-headed beauty, whose name, that's Caliph, Caliph, whatever. That's Caliph.
Badass.
And is proper mental. And she then pretty much becomes the head of the Amazons over there, and the Amazons come from her. Would that go through to the mother worship of the old world, and could that translate? Absolutely could. And if we're dealing with an entity that is an old one, then this totally all adds up. It works. It all fits together quite neatly. There's nothing there that wouldn't go. What we have here is a beautiful merging of lores where we've got old ones and elf pantheon. And that, I think, should be kept. Because it works.
Yeah, the Volumes of the Empire, or Archives of the Empire, Volume 3, if you haven't picked it up, it's a genuinely good book. It directly steals some of Andy's old writings, which is hilarious. On the hedge wizards, they literally just copy that. They just took all the stuff and just put it in there. But
copy paste. Do I get credit? No, I don't. God damn it.
The Old Faith section, though, is really interesting. The other thing it talks about with Godoran is that she is unlike the other gods of this Old Faith pantheon, she is a cosmic force that gave birth to these other gods of I think there's like 4 or 5 of them. But yeah, super interesting. Rig is awesome. I hope they do more with Rig. I would love to get full-on playable Amazons outside of Blood Bowl at some point in my life. Would be super great. All right, moving on. We have another god who actually is very interesting, and that's Tlonxla.
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 Written about that one a few times.
Yeah. So Tlonxla is the big bad of the warrior gods. It is the god with domains of tactics and strategy. It is the patron of the temple city of Tlonxla, which is named directly after it. And the thing that it was super well known was for fighting. That it literally rode its sky chariot wielding the revered spear of Tlonxla, which Krokar now wields, and charged into battle on its sky chariot, fighting against what the fuck we don't know. Whether it was probably dragons, probably ancient sky titans and horrible monstrosities from the deeps and all sorts of things. But this old one, the Lizardmen actively remember for kicking ass and chewing bubblegum.
Yeah. Tlonxla also has an unexpected connection through also the elven gods and the human gods. Because Tlonxla wields the Sword of Judgment. The literal Sword of Judgment, which is the symbol of the Grey Order, which is the symbol of Hoeth, the great two-handed sword of Hoeth that the Swordmasters of Hoeth carry, has passed down to the cult of Verena as the sword that sits between the great scales of Verena. Tlonxla is an unexpectedly heavy presence throughout the world for judgment and for basically ending things. And for coming down and saying, here is a thing I disagree with, slap. So yeah.
Yeah, what's fascinating to go along with that is the way Tlonxla's spear works that Krokar wields is that when he stabs someone with it or cuts them, what it does is if you're struck by it, it quite literally causes your vision, your mind to be overwhelmed by flashes of doom-laden visions of just suffering and of you just like being, it causes you to just collapse in on yourself, to just give up, to just fall down and submit.
And if we go over to elf lore, during the during the latter part of the cataclysm, when Azurin had returned, so had remanifested himself at the top of the Shrine of Azurin, and that's surrounded by the forces of chaos, and the last remaining of the Kadai are at war there. The manifestation of Hoeth that's there, the god who is literally there, had stolen its way down to the southern gate, and at the southern gate had warred against the entities that were down there that had exploded and stolen the Sword of Tlonxla, which had fallen into the hands of an entity that went by the name of Ulgu, and had taken the Shadow Blade from Ulgu and then come back to fight with the remaining gods at the Shrine of Azurin. So the Sword of Tlonxla, which becomes the Sword of Judgment elsewhere, is pretty much grounded in that myth. So the entirety of the links of Ulgu and shadow magic through to swords is all grounded in the myth from the elves, which in turn is grounded in the weapon that's supposedly one of the weapons directly wielded by an old one, which is kind of fucking cool. I mean, it's kind of fucking cool.
Yeah. That time, man, you could do such a fun campaign of a Swordmaster of Hoeth encountering Krokar and like that leading to all sorts of crazy shit.
Totally.
Like, oh my god, look at his wielding. Also, that if we ever saw the actual sort of judgment, if you look at like what the revered spear looks like, how crazy looking the sort of judgment might be.
It'd be one of those moments where you'd be, oh, this is just like Assassin's Creed, isn't it? When you get the old ancient artifacts and they're completely weird. Yeah, totally.
So next up, this is another old one that got a slight improvement thanks to Total War. It actually made him a bit more interesting. Is Tiscali. So Tiscali is the Lord of Strength, and Tiscali's domain is very, very. This one I like because it's the application of power. Now, the unique thing about Tiscali is he doesn't represent physical strength; he represents conceptual strength. So the ability to influence events, the ability to influence people's decisions, politics, economies. The ability to be a mover and shaker of the world, which is a really interesting set of domains. It's very simple. That's really all there is, but I like it because there's a fascinating, like, what was this old one? What was it like? What was it teaching that's what's remembered about it?
Yeah, that's about it, really, isn't it? Not much else to say other than that's an old one.
Yep. Here is probably the scariest of the warrior gods. Is Tizcatli. So Tizcatli had the domain of strength of attack, so being aggressive.
Yeah, that's it.
Embodied ferocity, uniquely among the old ones, is pretty much ignored by non-Saurus. So skinks don't really revere it, Kroxigors don't, and the Slann definitely don't. However, the important thing about Tizcatli is that, at least according to the Saurus, the way you worship is to rip out the heart of your enemy while it's still beating and to swallow it whole. Because you acquire their strength. You add their strength onto your own. But if you ever see a Saurus eating somebody's heart, that's why. Because it's literally worshiping an old one.
See, now there we have ourselves potentially an older story of how the material realm is composed of stuff that can be consumed in the same way that magical power can be consumed and create a particular effect, but can be used to consume more than just the thing that you're physically eating. Vampires, for example, are a prime example of being able to use consumption to gain magical energy from things. And there's a host of things in the Warhammer world where this is the case. And if we're dealing with a bunch of effectively both etheric and material entities, then it's quite possible that they were subsisting and eating also. So it suggests that they were drawing strength from the things they were eating in a way that was deeper than just simply gaining material sustenance. And that sounds like a repercussion of that potential, and also gives a very clear idea of where someone like Nagash could get his first inclination of being able to use the material realm solely to gain access to the immaterial and thus become a material god without needing the immaterial aspects. In fact, we get ourselves a very clear story that I 100% would have dialed down on when I was doing my Nagash parts of any particular campaign, because they are clearly connected.
Yep. Next up is an old one that is very important for how little is written about him, which is Ushmak. So Ushmak is the messenger of the gods. He's Hermes. And Ushmak. It is said that Ushmak will arrive and declare that the old ones have returned. He is the herald. He will one day return to the world and announce that the old ones are returning. Spoiler, he doesn't.
He doesn't, which is, I feel, an absolute crime.
Yeah, there should have been an end times thing related to that. 100%.
Yeah, and the end times thing should have been him returning and removing many of the most important servants of the Lizardmen from the old world. Well, from the Warhammer
that would have been such a better way to handle that. Instead of the Lizardmen just being like, activate space engines, if it was instead Uxmak coming back and being like, it's time.
Yeah, it's time. And them going, what the fuck? But yeah, absolutely. That should have occurred. It did not.
Next up is the one that, if you had to say the Lizardmen he's probably in the top 3 of ones the Lizardmen are terrified of, which is Shapati. So Shapati, whose domain is the restoration of order. This is the judge. So Shapati is to be invoked by the Lizardmen before righting a wrong. Now, what's interesting is this specifically often refers to dealing with possessed Lizardmen, so Lizardmen that have been possessed by demons, which can happen. Shapati is called upon before they're killed. But what's really interesting is he's also called upon to deal with errant Lizardmen. Lizardmen that have spawned and there's something wrong with them. They're not performing their role correctly, or they have started to think in a way that is not believed to work with the great plan. If a lizardman is problematic, then they will be ritually killed in the name of Shapati to keep the great plan on course, which tells a really interesting story about the lizardmen. Tahenowin, Maybe Tahenowin wasn't the first of his kind. He was simply the first one that was successful.
Yeah, totally. Well, what does the plan entail?
Yeah. The interesting thing about Shapati is there is an item associated with him, which is the Blood Statuette of Spite. And the Blood Statuette of Spite, in order to be taken into battle, it's a statue made in the likeness of Shapati, which of course they don't tell us what that looks like, but it's made in its likeness, and it has to be bathed in sacrificial blood given willingly. So sacrificial blood has to be given onto this statue, bathed in it, and then on the battlefield, if you raise it up and call upon Shapati's name, it smites people. And its tabletop rules were brutal as fuck. You literally would point at an enemy and go, all right, I'm using it now. And you just kept rolling dice until I think you rolled a 1 or a 2 or they were dead. Like it just went bam, 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 and they just killed over dead.
Yeah, fucking sucked. That's all I can say to that one.
Like D&D Divine Smite, that is what Shapati does. He smites the fuck out of people.
Yeah, when we were when I was building a completely different story, this was going to be effectively the mind that lay behind Tlanxla. So this would be the one that made the choice, the one that sat in judgment, while Tlanxla would be the sword of judgment directly.
Oh, that would be. Yeah,
they were going to be originally tied together with a story thing, but that never came. So that's as far away from ever being published as you can imagine. Yeah, but it definitely was going to be a thing.
You can see a relationship there, though, between those two.
Yeah.
All right. Next up is one a lot of us know and love, Shodel. Good old Shodel. Shodel, who has the domain of fate and
you've missed one on my notes. This one, which is Japiti, which is 100% a typo of Japati.
Oh.
I'm just bringing that one up because I'm telling you it's a typo. That's in the Lizardmen army list. It's just on my list that's over here because I've got a little list that I pulled out from my old notes. I've got my old notes sitting here.
Your new old one that shows up because someone misspelled it. Yeah,
100% it's a misspelling. I'm certain.
You look over at like Tiscali and Tiscatli, and the only difference is an L turned to a T, and you're like, I think they're separate, but
and sometimes you're like, these are just the same ones that they've done a spelling mistake. When someone can misspell something like the Drakvald from the Darkvald, then you know that this sort of thing can and will happen because these are being written often by they're being written by English speakers, and they're constantly getting other languages, particularly ones that they're half making up, completely wrong.
So Shodel, domain, fate, and destined ones. Selects those marked for greatness, and his glyph is marked on all spawning pools. Of course, Krokar, as we all know, is a sacred spawning of Shodel, and Shodel's power quite literally protects him. He has this nightmarish divine protection that is actually very, very strong. Krokar is a hard bitch to kill because he's destined to live until the end. That's just what Shodel does, baby. Pretty nasty one. Next up, we have a really interesting one that there's not a lot specific, but there's a lot of interesting little tidbits, which is Sholonka the Lost. Mm-hmm. So Sholonka is supposedly an old one who, for some reason, decided that it had to leave and go back to the beginning of time itself to deal with something. And that once it dealt with whatever this issue was at the beginning of time, that it would return. Now, what's interesting is that the old ones, when they built, when they ordered the Lizardmen to build temples and monuments to Sholonka, Sholonka is associated with a sense of grief, a sense of grieving for someone that is lost, which almost seems to insinuate more that Sholonka is like genuinely just dead. Or lost to such an whatever it did, it went beyond what the old ones could even comprehend, which is a story. And actually, if you watch LAWhammer, there's a note in I can't remember what episode it is, but there's a note where there's a character talking about some really nasty baddies who are also trying to move through time to fuck shit up way back. And you look at Sri Lanka and you go, oh, maybe he's the one that makes sure that doesn't happen.
So I quite like this one because there's a nice little myth that's tied there, and it reinforces the concepts of the old ones being directly tied to an empire that itself expands over time, not just space. And that's quite fun. And it obviously has very strong influences from Doctor Who. You can almost feel someone's watched Doctor Who and gone, I'm just going to steal that bit and pretty much copy paste it directly in here. You have yourself potentially even the myth of where the entirety of this millennia spanning empire has come from, which will be this figure who perhaps goes back to try and solve everything and set it off. If you're looking to build a story, this is clearly the one that starts the great plan. Having seen something in the present, it goes back to the past to set the great plan in place to ensure that the future will not be affected by it. If you're looking for a old one, old one to be directly responsible for the Warhammer world, this is it.
Yeah, I do like that there's that implication of sorrow, though. Like, it was a sacrifice for it to go back and do this.
And I think that that's a fun aspect of it. I'd say that if you're looking to build some really cool stories for your own games, use this one, because this one will rationalize much of what the old ones eventually do. It will rationalize the great plan. It will make sense of all of it, all potentially because it was there at the cataclysm, and it sees it all goes wrong, goes back and says, no, we actually intended for this all to happen in the first place. So the great plan is a response to it going wrong. That's why you can get both. It's a mistake and it's planned for, because the old ones are not stuck in time. And because of that, that means they can respond to things live in a way that no other species can.
All right, we got 3 left. Next up is
I have 3 left in mine too. Woo-hoo! We've got the same number.
Good. So we've got Shoka, the Arbiter of Duty. So Shoka is known as the Lord of Stone. And its domain is stone and the concept of duty. Offerings. So what's interesting about this one is that it simultaneously represents a physical concept and a metaphysical concept. Of that. So offerings are often made to Shoka to grant strength to the Lizardmen to meet their responsibilities, even though it will result in their death. So, like, if you're going into, I have to do this, but I'm going to die, you call upon Shoka. However, the other really interesting thing about Shoka is that Shoka built structures as the Lord of Stone. He quite literally crafted several pyramids of importance throughout the Lustria. And a lot of the, like, super fucking crazy, like, flying pyramids that are, like, held in the air by the big, like, lightning beams of energy and stuff are associated with Shoka. But he's fun. Especially because it also helps that reinforcement of a lot of people think the Lizardmen are just like emotionless automatons, but the fact that there's an old one, there's a deity they call upon to give them strength when they're about to face their death, shows there's more to it than that.
Much more. And we discussed that to a degree in one of the previous streams. I forget which one it was. Of course it was Tenuin. Of course it was Tenuin. We discussed that to some extent into Tenuin, and also the evolution of the Lizardmen as a species as a whole.
Yeah, Quintus, there could be. If you want to tie specific old ones to maybe having encountered some of the younger races, that is certainly a possibility there.
Quintus, in fact, I'd go further on that one and say that if you're looking to build an overall picture for the Warhammer world, then absolutely there should be the link there, because we need to have old ones who are responsible for contacting and working towards some outcome for the dwarfs. And we have a very clear option here for one who would not just find them interesting, potentially, but fashion them in that direction. So perhaps we've got ourselves an old one who is partly responsible for what the dwarves become.
Yep. And just like Potek from earlier, the next old one is kind of hilarious because both of them were actually magic items in 5th edition that got upgraded to being old ones, which is Sholok. So Sholok it's an old one that has the domain of precision. And and quite literally he originates from a magic item that Lord Mazdamundi had back in 5th edition. Yeah. But what Sholok is that glyphs of Sholok can be inscribed by the Lizardmen onto items and it will cause them to absorb energy and to store it until the proper moment.
Yeah.
And this tied back to the plaques of Sholok, which are a mass-produced plaque that the Slaanesh can have with them. And if it's essentially broken, it unleashes a great whoosh of magic energy that the Slaanesh could then grab onto and make into a spell. To go along with what Quintus said earlier, sounds a lot like rune magic, don't it? Don't it? So there's something there. And the last one, who is actually genuinely one of the most interesting, despite being at the very bottom of the list, is Yusha. Yusha had the domain of language and speech. Mm-hmm. And Yusha is said to have created the concept of language and the first language, which is, if you know about how language works in Warhammer, it is a big, huge fucking deal.
Yeah. This is possibly the downfall of the old ones. Now that might sound a bit mental to say just as a straight out, but we're just going to take a single old one and say that that's what's responsible. No, because remember, most of the old ones epitomize concepts. They might not have been individuals, but they almost certainly were. Many of them will be nothing more than words that have been passed down to the later generations of Lizardmen that they have turned into old ones who may not have been old ones in the first place. Some of them will have been literal people, but the concept here of what is effectively intelligence. It is taking and reshaping the material realm using word, and every single word has an effect in the material realm, and if it's channeled through with magic will cause things to happen in the material realm when they're merged. And that is because over on the immaterial side, things have begun to grow there, and they have begun to grow there because of sentience, and it has in turn gained its own sentience that is ultimately the formation of the Chaos Gods. You could argue that the very concept of passing language on to the peoples of the Warhammer world ultimately led into the birth of the Chaos Gods. That is a particularly damning position, because if that's the case, then you could claim that Yusha is responsible for the fall and the cataclysm. And in turn, one of the old ones goes, well, I better hike it back to the past to change that. So we've got ourselves a potential story building here, because we know how important language is to the very concept of the Warhammer world as a whole. And we have ourselves here an old one who is directly responsible, supposedly, for passing on the concept of language, not just to the Lizardmen, but to everyone. And that is horrendous, because that has effectively granted sentience to not just the material realm, but the immaterial realm also.
Yeah,
and
Yusha,
that would suggest...
Yeah, Yusha I like quite a bit, because it specifically goes out of its way to insinuate that Yusha actually directly interacted with the warm-blooded races to teach them language. Which, like, man, that's like Andy, everything Andy just said, 100%. Yusha,
and possibly more.
Yeah, Yusha, depending on how you look at it, is like one of the greatest benefactors of the world, while also being the biggest villain of the entire setting, without meaning to.
Yeah, quite. As someone, in fact, as Wander Alpha just popped up there, literally a Prometheus figure. Yeah, quite literally a Prometheus figure. And I think that's great. I think that is something that is a massively cool story that has definitely not been told. It's been hinted at. And it's been hinted at because we know that just saying a demon's name is effectively evoking that demon, because true names mean something in the Warhammer world. Words mean something in the Warhammer world. Diction, the ability to express yourself with word. The words of magic is the truest form of describing the material realm, but you can use magic with any language at all. All it requires is intent and belief and understanding, which is why some hedge wizards and why some untrained wizards can literally just go, I bring fire down upon thee, and just throw magic, and it works, while you'll have the lingua prestantia being a far more precise version of the language of magic that was originally taught to humans by the elves, and the elves in turn learned that from their gods, who very likely may have learned them from Yusha. We have got ourselves a clear step-by-step process for the formation of the one language of Warhammer, what is often referred to as the lingua prestantia incorrectly, but language demonic for another way. The very true way of expressing everything in the material realm has come from the old ones, and it's dangerous. Really dangerous. Really dangerous stuff.
This gun.
Yeah, so it very much feels like here we have, through the intent of something potentially beautiful, which is to grant all of these little creatures the ability to communicate, to work with each other, to better understand the world around them. And this old one has accidentally also unleashed a deeper, meaningful impact upon the Aether, which ultimately ends with the collapse of the gates and the formation of the Chaos Gates. And we have a sort of an unspoken story behind that, where we then also know another old one goes back in time because they were so horrified by something that occurred. The obvious thing to be horrified by is the cataclysm. The obvious result is the influence of the old ones themselves have caused this to come about, and they attempt to go back in time and stop it and make it the great plan. That allows you to have both your cake and to eat it. It allows you to have the old ones make a huge mistake, but for the old ones to have also planned it all in the first place. It allows Age of Sigmar to be the planned outcome, while simultaneously have the whole thing be a giant fuck up that was never supposed to have happened in the first place. Beneficent sorcerer scientists arrive, and then their first intent was just to, you know, be beneficent, spread their empire, everything's great, woo! And then that turns into eradicate the world, lizardmen everywhere! We are doing something else because we have to stop the birthing of chaos that's coming anyway. So everything changes. There's a super fun story lying behind the scenes there, which would be, I think, fun to plumb, even if it was written in a very different way to how I've just very basically outlined one version that it could have. But there's a super fun story there.
One of the things that I would love to see GW do is that, like, yes, you want to keep the old ones shrouded in myth, but you should still tell the myths. They like to keep them a little too shrouded in secrecy.
Agreed completely.
It's like, oh, this doesn't have to be true, but here's a version of what may have been true with these various gods.
Yeah, myths are fun. And that's one of the reasons why when we were doing the Tomb of Salvation, that some of these myths were purposefully added. We got references to Sotek and snake gods drifting in through human myths as well. We got references to the Sword of Judgment. We got references to elven gods and the impact that they had on the Empire. And they, in turn, the elven gods, were influenced by the old ones that came before that. All of this is myth that should be interwoven because it is an interwoven world. If we try to make each race, each species, each faction have its own individual myths and they don't interact, it makes the world feel smaller and weird and not really a connected place. Where if we can then tell these myths, all of which could be wrong, then as writers you've got much more breadth to really add color to the world.
Phil, didn't catch the first half of the stream, but have you mentioned the old ones have made their first landfall in Albion? Real smooth, GW. So the Albion is a really interesting thing. We don't have a lot of time to go into this. Albion would make its own. We'll do an Albion stream at some point because there's a ton of shit.
Look at the time.
yeah. So we're just gonna get caught up on super chats and we're done. But there's some fun things to do there.
So them first landing there is fine, but the first place where they build their cities is Lustria, and that's pretty much the case across the board.
The first city, that being said, Albion plays a very fucking titanic role in the Great Plan.
It does.
Ricky Chapman, are there people who worship the old ones in the other parts of the world and abandon Lisbon cities, brand ancient plaques can't read? Yes, 100%.
Yeah, sure, all the time. Yeah. Yep. Warhammer World is full of people praising things that don't deserve praise.
I mean, hell, you wouldn't even have to go that crazy in parts of the world. I'm like, you could say, oh, there's some guy in the old world who's like an eccentric person that got a hold of a sacred plaque and is like, oh, this is the truth. This is the great. I'm going to worship this thing. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to worship this thing.
Yeah, people are going to people.
Yep. Seth, I got a theory. The Faustschlag is actually a chunk of an old one moon base, bringing Kuei Yin with it. The Monkey King and Ulrich stole it during a wacky monkey magic styled adventure.
I definitely think there could be something pretty freaking mental done with all that. There is clearly a tie through from the Faustschlag to Morsleb, though.
Yes. Morsleb or Manslib?
Manslib.
No,
God damn it. I meant to say Manslib. God damn it. Thanks.
Donovan, thank you for the bits. Do you think the Warhammer World was the only planet the old ones uplifted? No. We know for a fact they mess with other planets. Like, that's not even
possibly millions of them.
They had a huge empire.
Yeah.
All over the stars.
And all over time as well.
Yeah, that's why there's kind of that constant, like, about when the cataclysm went off. If it's like, oh, did that kill all the old ones? Or did they simply abandon the world? And the reason the abandoned storyline is very strong is because they had this huge, massive empire. Now, it could have been that there was a chain reaction and that all of their gates literally everywhere blew up all at the same time, in which case they very likely died. But, you know, there's no answer. It's a myth, or it's a mystery. Don't understand mother, never studied an animal. The Lizardmen. The Lizardmen are funny when it comes to... the thing you have to understand about the Lizardmen is that if it's not relevant to the Great Plan, they don't tend to think about it.
Yeah, and it's not that they don't understand the concept, it's just they don't believe that it applies. That would be better. It's not what old ones are. Old ones are to them, they're in many respects, they're made in the old one's image. And thus, the old ones are the same as them. In the same way that you tend to find that gods of humans are made in humanity's image, or the god of the elves are made in elven images. And that being the case, it's not that they don't understand per se, it's that they just simply don't think it's the case. And when they see something that stands contrary to it, they're like, yeah, no, that doesn't make sense. It's not real. It's not true. It's not part of the plan. Screw that.
There's a really stupid joke in there somewhere of the Slan seeing a naked woman being like, I don't get it. I just don't get it. It's confusing. Get it away from me. Jonathan Scott. In my opinion, it was really just a pretty all right plan. Yeah. Honestly, I think several of the old ones. Yeah, I think several of the old ones would probably agree with you, to be frank. Thanks for all the content and for uploading it to Spotify, my favorite outlet. Well, thank you,
marvelous.
Scramble Ramble. We appreciate the super chat. Thank you. CB4N, all this time travel talk just reinforces my theory that the dude from Chrono Trigger was just a Slan all along.
There you go.
This adds to my theory that the old ones were chased to the Warhammer world. That's certainly possible.
I don't feel that that's necessarily a bad conclusion to make.
Especially if you decide to go with like the 8th edition Big Red Book theory, or like the 5th edition Lizardman book theory, where it's like the old ones were trying to make a race to destroy chaos. It gives the implication that they were running from chaos, or they were already fighting it. Mm-hmm. Geomancy is the old one positioning system, or oops.
I like that, Mornington.
Yeah, that's really good. Markism, I thought it might make sense that the Chaos Gods came from the aspects that the old ones have intentionally severed from themselves and discarded / trapped in the ether. Does this hold any water? You could work with that.
You could.
It'd be tricky. You'd have to do a lot of little...
So what you need to do is build a story to make that happen. For example, the old ones, upon seeing the great churn in the other side, go, oh, this is too dangerous. It's killing us. It might be killing us, this great churn. So they separate themselves from the aether, and through the separation, the part that's separated churns up and gains sentience itself into the Chaos Gods. You could build that story, but it would be a new story. It wouldn't be the story that's currently being told. So you would be building something entirely new.
Yeah, because the closest thing to that would be that there are 3 common, like, oh, this is what happened to the old one offers given, which is that they all died, they fled, or that they were like possessed or somehow turned into the dark gods. Those 3 you see pop up a lot. The third one, though, is pretty, like, it gets dropped and picked up and dropped and picked up. The main 2
because
are...
we know the Chaos Gods existed long before the old ones vanished.
Yeah, so the big one is that they died or they fled. What is the rise of Nagash in relation to the Great Plan? As far as I know, the Slan didn't do anything about it. Well, maybe that was part of the plan.
If it's part of the Great Plan, then of course they did. They put it into place in the first place, and they just left it. They didn't touch it. They didn't need to because it happened. One of the great joys of the Great Plan is no matter what you do, it's the Great Plan. No matter what happens, it's the Great Plan. It was supposed to occur this way. It's great, unless it's sitting on a plaque. When they look at the plaque and they go, oh, this plaque says we're meant to go this way, so they follow the plaque. Basically, what the plaques do is they provide them with direction whenever the Great Plan isn't going to make itself happen. So you could argue from their perspective, Nagash is 100% their plan.
Yeah, you could also just say that they were
sort of logic.
Yeah, you could also say they were just completely unaware of it until it was too late, because I think that was during the age of isolationism, so they didn't really know what was going on.
But then that was part of the Great Plan too.
Which old one most likely feuded with the Monkey King? If I would have to know more about the Monkey King to answer that.
Yeah, Monkey King is an incredibly difficult character to pin down at the moment.
Yeah.
I believe we're at the end.
Yes, we are. Thank you. Hope you all enjoy.
I have a summation, though. I have a couple of little things I'd like to say to end off with, because I do like to have an end.
Keep us over time, then by all means.
It's only an extra minute or so. What difference will it make? So, what have we learned? We have learned that originally the old ones were the old Slann. That's what their original conception was. And that they were nothing more than a manifestation of Games Workshop's version of the gods were nothing more than an ancient civilization that handed down information to later generations. And in their version, it was the frogmen that did this. The frogmen from space, who passed down all of the civilization that the Warhammer world would later come to have. And in the older version, the frogmen from space done fucked up and created chaos in error. That changes in time. And that changes because the stories that Games Workshop begin to tell in later editions separate the Slann from the old Slann and into the old ones. But there is nothing, not one single bit in the current lore that says directly that the old ones can't be old Slann. If you wish them to be, they can be. That's fine. But there is definitely some things that they say they are. And that is that they are transcendental beings. They are not Slann. Now, the first generation Slann, you could argue, are also transcendental beings. Just look at how crazy some of the things that they did were. So that's not to say there's no link between the two, but the modern Slann are definitely nothing like the old ones. And if you want to believe that they are basically the old Slann, that I do not think is inconsistent with the lore. You can do that. It won't in any way interrupt the lore as it stands, because when the 5th edition army list came out for the Lizardmen and turned them from the old Slann into the old ones, they didn't change the stories. The stories are the same. And then they just got additional detail as time went on, most of which was in character detail, meaning that it could be wrong, based upon an artifact, based upon one entity's belief, or whatever. So the old story can stand if you wish, but it's quite clear that Games Workshop themselves have gone in a different direction now, where the old ones were probably something different. But it's still a relatively new innovation, because as late as the 2000s, the Slann, the old Slann of 40k were still the Slanny, and they looked like the frogmen. And you'll find that they pop up again and again and again.
The current 40k old ones are literally just the Slann.
Yeah, they are. And that means that you could very easily go, so what we had was the first spawning, who were the tall, almost humanoid, frog-like entities that were the old ones, and they were probably shapeshifters. And that doesn't mean that they were changing shape from one thing to another. It just means that their material forms were inconsistent because they were transcendental. They were quite literally not just simply mortal beings. They could change shape, they could mix with, they could appear as human, they could appear as other, but their genetic code was the frog. And they made the first spawning of the Slann from their own genetic code. They were literally made in their image. And that if we found any corpses of old ones, they would probably be frog-like, and that would absolutely match the lore as it currently stands. They were human-sized. We have some of their artifacts. They could be wielded by human-sized hands. They were human-like. We know that because of the few images we have of the sorts of tools that they were using and the size of those tools. They didn't have large hands like dwarves. They had smaller hands. They didn't have the big, huge toad Slann-like hands either. They were smaller. They were probably human-sized. The story makes sense of them being the old Slann miniatures because no one has ever contradicted it, but they have reinforced it again and again and again with incidental details. And that is proper crazy. 5 fingers, by the way, for the old Slann miniatures, just to make sure that we pop in that one.
And I'll say from the back of the room, no.
Regardless of the no, because that goes against largely what 8th edition suggests, but the story is intact for that being the case. The story is intact for the old ones being.
You can absolutely make that work without doing anything.
It's not. You don't need to create anything. The story.
Rig is literally the only hurdle.
And she's not hurdle because she can appear as anything. All the old ones quite clearly could. She could have appeared human while they were dealing with it, could have mixed with elven DNA, could have created those things. They are transcendental beings. And I have no issue with that at all. And I think that makes sense of it all. But that is not Games Workshop's current answer. Now, you might find an individual writer thinks that's great. You might find another individual writer thinks it's stupid. But we then fall back on the oldest question of all when writing Games Workshop lore, which is, what lore can we use? That's a big question, because whenever you're asked to write something, and I have been in the past, as have many others as well, the answer is generally always whatever is in the most recent edition of the war game. That's it. You don't look at the novels, you don't look at the games, you don't look at the licensed stuff. It's that. And then everything else is possibly something you can use if Games Workshop agree. And when it comes to the rulebooks, the answer that's found there is, if it's not been overwritten, the most recent version is the case. And it was never overwritten. The old ones were never made anything but slan. And the big fat toad men that came later, they're just bloated with magic, a completely different version of what came before. So we could say, actually categorically, that as far as the lore is concerned, the old ones are the old slan. Because it's never been overwritten. All they've added is myth. But that is, I would argue very strongly, not anything that any Games Workshop writer would be ever allowed to do, because that is something that the lore has moved beyond. The truth of it is that the old ones are these transcendental beings that no longer are tied to the old slan. But if you want to make it different, not only could you do so, Games Workshop's own way that they use their lore would suggest that that's the correct path to take.
And then we're all just sitting there sweating nervously for the day Age of Sigmar inevitably gets an old one character.
It's going to happen, and then they're going to go, hey, it's not a frog at all, and that'll be fine. But that would mean, if you wish, that Kremlo would be an old one.
And this is why, at least everything Andy said the last 7 minutes is heresy, and he will be burned at the stake.
I have purposely done it just so I can say that about Kremlo.
Like, where is he going with this?
Anything from Warhammer First Edition that we can somehow bring back deserves a mention, and that's Warhammer First Edition. I mean, you couldn't get older in terms of lore than that.
Kill your darlings. All right. Okay, we are well over time. So
we are indeed. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. I don't know what we're going to do on Wednesday. We'll figure that out later. And we'll see what we see. See you next week for the Q&A. And I don't remember what the week after that is, but we'll figure it out.
We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.